Hello, and welcome to another long, quiet journey through the slower corners of history. This is not a tale of battles or kings, but of threads patiently passed from hand to hand, and of looms that whispered through the centuries. Tonight, we'll follow the thread that never ends, a thread spun by forgotten hands, woven into tunics, cloaks, sails, and shrouds. We'll drift from the ancient world, where looms stood in quiet courtyards, to the medieval towns where guilds regulated the pace of weaving, and onward, to the age when the loom itself began to change. This is not the history of great noise or drama, but of repetition, of shuttles moving back and forth, of cloth growing slowly, almost without notice, until it became something whole. So settle in. Let the rhythm of weaving accompany you like a gentle lullaby, and allow the thread of history to carry you softly, quietly toward sleep. You might imagine that the northern lights, the aurora borealis, were always viewed with awe, with whispers of magic, with dancing stories passed from fire to fire. That is true, of course, but it is only part of the tale. For the Inuit hunters who lived under those skies, the lights were not simply spectacles. They were also guides, small hints within the night, indicators that one could use while the world was otherwise a blur of ice and drifting snow. To understand this, you must first picture the land. Imagine standing in silence on sea ice that stretches so far that the horizon looks almost too close, the way it does when nothing blocks the eye but emptiness. The cold is not simply cold. It presses against your lungs when you breathe. Each exhale leaves a trace of frost that clings to the fur lining of your hood. The boots on your feet comics sewn from sealskin creak softly as you shift your weight. Even that sound seems too loud in the winter stillness. Now imagine you are not standing still. You are walking, slowly, steadily, perhaps for hours. Beside you, other hunters walk as well. Sometimes you move in silence, sometimes with low murmurs that vanish into the wind. Ahead of you lies nothing certain. The prey you follow may be seals resting by their breathing holes, or caribou moving across the tundra. You cannot see them. You only know the signs. A faint track, a small hole in the snow, a distant memory of where animals once passed. And above you, there is the sky, shifting with pale green ribbons of light. For the Inuit, the northern lights were not merely decorations. They were companions. Some stories said they were the spirits of the dead playing a game in the sky. Others said they were the torches of ancestors lighting the way. But for the hunter, walking across miles of white silence, they were also orientation points. The lights appeared more strongly in the north, faintly in the south, weaving across the horizon. A hunter could glance upward and remember, this is the direction of the coast. That is the way back toward camp. It is here that the boring details begin to matter. Because when your life depends on knowing whether to turn left or right in a storm, even the faintest glow of light can be as important as a compass. Inuit hunters had no magnetic compasses, no maps on paper, no written records. Instead, they had memory, and they had the sky. The stars gave guidance on clear nights, but when clouds and snow swallowed the heavens, the green pulse of the aurora became something to notice, something to align yourself with. And so we begin, not with drama, but with patience. The hunter lifts a harpoon across his shoulder, the bone tip glinting faintly in moonlight. He checks his sled, the dogs restless but quiet. He waits, not for a signal of excitement, but for stillness, the right kind of stillness, the one that suggests the ice beneath his feet is steady. He listens to the faint crackling of the aurora above, for some claim they could hear it whisper like static. Whether or not that sound is real is still debated, but in that moment, to the hunter, it is real enough. Consider the clothing, not glamorous, but essential. Caribou hides worn with the fur inward for insulation. Outer layers of seal or polar bear fur for protection against wind. Mittens stitched from multiple layers of skin, all carefully prepared by the women of the camp. Each stitch matters. A seam too loose will let in air. A boot too thin will let frostbite crawl across the toes. The boring labor of sewing, day after day, was as important to the survival of the hunter as the chase itself. Now think of food. Before the hunt, the hunter eats little, saving supplies. A strip of dried fish, a chunk of frozen caribou fat, a sip of melted snow, nothing more. Each bite is rationed with careful thought. The journey may last longer than expected, and in the cold, hunger arrives faster. Again, the boring details. A pouch of food tucked inside a parka so that it does not freeze solid. A skin bag filled with seal oil for lighting lamps. When one returns, it is in such quiet necessities that we begin to understand the rhythm of the hunt. Unlike in stories, where the hunter sees his prey immediately, here there is waiting. Always waiting. You walk for hours, then pause. You kneel beside a hole in the ice, watching, breathing slowly, so your breath does not spook the seal beneath. Minutes pass, then hours. The sky shifts above you. The aurora bends and flickers. You tell yourself that the spirits are watching. You wonder whether the seal will rise today or tomorrow, or not at all. This waiting is where boredom becomes survival. For those listening now, perhaps lying in your bed, this is where you may drift a little. Imagine being there, crouched in the snow, the ice hard beneath your knees, the northern lights above you. Nothing happens. Nothing at all. And yet everything depends on this waiting. The aurora's presence gave reassurance in that endless wait. Hunters told one another that the lights could guide souls, that they could carry messages between the living and the dead. But they also noted their direction, their arc. A hunter who spent a night on the ice might return to camp by following where the aurora thinned, where the glow dipped toward the horizon. The light was not just beauty, it was information. And so we see the balance, myth and practicality. To live in such a land required both. You could not survive by only believing in stories, but you could not survive without them either. Stories carried knowledge, and knowledge carried survival. Imagine now that you are the hunter, and dawn does not come. The sun stays low, hidden below the horizon. It may be weeks before you see it rise again. Darkness stretches endlessly, and the aurora dances night after night. How do you know when to return, when to rest, when to wait longer? Perhaps you look again to the sky. You measure not by clocks or hours, but by the subtle changes in light. You notice how the aurora glows brighter when the cold is sharper. You notice how the dogs grow restless when the night grows too long. These details, small and repetitive, shape the rhythm of your life. And so, the boring history begins not with grand battles or kings, but with silence. with the sound of your own breath in the cold, with the small decisions of waiting, watching, and trusting the lights above. But one must ask, were the northern lights truly guides, or were they simply companions, illusions of direction when none existed? Did the hunters find their way because of the aurora, or because of their own memory and endurance? And with that question known, not easily answered. If in the first part we lingered with the silence of the hunt, here we step deeper into the slow structure of daily life. Because the aurora itself could only ever be one part of survival. Hunters did not wake each day, look at the sky, and instantly know what to do. Instead, their decisions were bound up in habits, in the passed down patterns of older generations, and in the sheer memory of how to endure. It is worth considering what memory meant in such a land. No written words, no permanent maps, no archives that you or I might flip through in a library. Instead, the map was the body. Memory was carried in footsteps. You walked the same routes until your muscles knew them better than your eyes. Each hunter's feet were a record of geography. They learned the cracks of certain ice sheets, the subtle incline of the snow where rivers froze beneath, the places where seals tended to surface. And in this practice of remembering, the aurora played a background role, always there, like a friend one barely speaks to but who walks silently beside you. The light told you direction when storms erased landmarks, and yet the deeper memory told you when the prey might appear. Imagine again, if you can, the endless white horizon. Nothing marks it, no trees, no mountains in view, only the occasional ridge where snow has drifted. A stranger would be lost instantly, but the hunter knows this ridge bends toward a river. That faint depression signals a caribou trail. To walk in such a place without memory would be like being blind. And so each hunter carried in his or her own body a map that could not be written down. Food, as ever, was the true purpose of this memory. Caribou, when hunted, could feed not only a single family, but an entire camp. Their skins, their antlers, their sinew had use. But to find them was never easy. Hunters would recall the migration routes, as told by their fathers and grandfathers. They would watch the horizon for faint movement. They would listen to dogs who sniffed scents long before human noses could. And above, always, the aurora flickered, not telling where the animals were, but reminding the hunter of the space he walked through, the north, the south, the endless cold between. And then there were the seals. Their breathing holes were lifelines, small punctures in the ice where an animal below might surface for air. To hunt them required hours of patience. First, a hunter might brush away snow carefully until only a thin crust remained above the hole. Then he would kneel, not for minutes, for hours, sometimes longer, his body frozen still, his spear poised, his breath controlled. If he moved, the seal might sense it and turn away. The aurora's glow during such vigils was not only orientation, but company. Some said the lights whispered. Some said they crackled. Whether sound existed or not, what mattered was the hunter's focus, the ability to sit, to listen, to breathe, while the universe itself shifted above. It was here that myths seeped into practicality. Hunters told children that whistling at the aurora would draw it closer, sometimes dangerously so. Others claimed that the lights were spirits carrying messages between the living and the dead. To sit under them was to be noticed by those who had passed away. Did the hunter believe it? Perhaps, or perhaps not. But belief gave shape to patience. Belief reminded him why he waited. Think, now, of the camps left behind, women and children, elders and dogs, waiting to. Their work was less visible, but no less crucial. Clothing had to be repaired. Sinew had to be twisted into thread. Oil lamps needed constant tending, fed with seal oil and wicks made from moss or cotton grass. The lamp's flame was life, providing heat, light, and a way to dry clothing. Without it, frostbite would creep into the camp just as surely as hunger. The camp watched the sky as well. Children pointed at the aurora, laughed, sometimes feared it. Mothers warned them not to whistle. Elders murmured old stories. The hunters might be far away, crouching in silence, but they were connected through that same ribbon of light. We might pause here to consider a detail that feels minor, but is not. Dogs. Inuit sled dogs were more than companions. They were survival itself. Strong, thick-furred, able to endure the cold better than humans. They pulled sleds laden with supplies across distances that no person could manage alone. Hunters knew each dog by name, knew their strengths. A dog too stubborn might need correction. A dog too weak might be left behind. To an outsider, the dogs may have seemed only beasts, but to the hunter they were colleagues, sometimes even teachers. When the aurora lit the sky and storms threatened, dogs would still sense direction, tugging the sled toward home. It is easy to romanticize this life, but we must not forget how fragile it was. One missed seal, one failed caribou hunt, one night too long without food, and the aurora could glow as brightly as ever, but it could not fill the stomach. The boring truth of survival was in small tasks done carefully: rationing food, stitching seams, keeping lamps burning, walking patiently, waiting endlessly. The northern lights did not solve these hardships, but they were there, constant, shifting, and dancing. Hunters who lay on their backs in the snow after hours of waiting might stare upward and remind themselves, others before me have waited under this same light. Others have lived, and I will too now. There is another detail worth mentioning, a scientific one. Today, we know that the aurora is caused by charged particles from the sun colliding with Earth's atmosphere. But for the hunter, centuries ago, no such explanation existed. And perhaps it was unnecessary. What mattered was not what the lights were, but how they fit into life. Myths, stories, and survival all blended together until the aurora became both a compass and a symbol, a guide and a companion. But let us return to the hunt. Imagine, after hours of waiting, you finally feel it, the faintest stir of air at the hole. A sign. The spear tenses in your hand. You wait still, not moving, and then the seal rises, its nose breaking through the crust. In that instant, you thrust downward. If you succeed, you bring life to your camp: food, fur, oil. If you miss, the hole is empty again, and the waiting begins anew. The aurora flickers above, silent witness to your success or failure. And when you return home, dragging the sled behind, the camp greets you not with celebration, but with relief. The food is shared, the oil is stored, the clothing repaired with new sinew. Nothing wasted, nothing extravagant, nothing dramatic, Only survival, repeated again and again, night after night. You might think this sounds monotonous. It was. But monotony is not the enemy of life, is its structure. For the Inuit, the boring details of repetition, the same roots, the same weights, the same lights, above were what kept life possible. The aurora was always there, a reminder of continuity. And yet, there were times when the lights seemed to change. Times when they grew brighter than usual, or when colors, other than green, appeared violet, even white. Elders told stories then, stories of omens. Some said a bright red aurora meant war. Others said it meant plentiful hunting. But what did it truly mean to the hunter crouched on the ice? Did he take comfort, or did unease settle into his chest? Here we leave our hunter once again, crouching by his breathing hole, the aurora pulsing red above him. He grips his spear. He waits. He wonders what the color means. He wonders whether the lights are telling him something, or nothing at all. You have now walked with the hunter across the ice, felt the long waiting hours, and seen the aurora bending overhead like a patient companion. We return to that moment, the hunter crouched by the breathing hole, the lights above flickering in strange colors, the dogs silent in the distance. The strike has been made, a seal is caught, it is dragged slowly out of the hole, its body glistening in the dim glow. The hunter does not cheer. There is no celebration. Instead, there is work, slow, careful work. The animal must be prepared, its hide skinned cleanly, its fat preserved, its meat divided. The hunter knows that even in the cold, nothing can be left untended. A mistake now means wasted food, and wasted food means hunger later. Inuit tradition teaches that animals give themselves to the hunter if treated with respect. To waste them, to dishonor their gift, is to risk future scarcity. And so, the careful handling of the catch becomes ritual. The boring tasks of scraping, cutting, binding ball matter deeply. Each piece of the animal has a place in the cycle of survival. Above, the aurora shifts again. Perhaps the hunter glances at it, perhaps he does not. But the sky is always present, as if it observes the work below. For those who believe the lights are spirits, this is a moment of communion, the ancestors watching, approving, ensuring balance. For those who see only natural lights, it is still guidance, glow, to illuminate the path back to camp. Now comes the return journey. The dogs are harnessed, the sled loaded. The hunter begins the slow trek back. The aurora stretches across the horizon, green ribbons pointing vaguely northward. He does not think of them as a compass in the way you or I might. Instead, he notices their consistency, their relation to familiar landmarks. He knows the tilt of the ice here, the faint shadow of the landmass there. The aurora is not a direct map, but a reassurance, a reminder that he is not lost in the emptiness. The camp is waiting. Lamps burn low, tended through the long hours. Children stir in their furs, hungry but quiet. Elders sit in silence, remembering hunts of their youth. When the sled finally arrives, there is no noise of triumph, only the muted relief of survival continued. The seal is divided carefully, each family receiving its portion. Oil is stored, bones set aside, sinew stretched to dry, nothing wasted. Here, in the small circle of warmth, the aurora above becomes again a shared presence. The camp looks upward, Children whisper their fears of the lights reaching down to seize them. Elders smile faintly, recalling tales of souls carried skyward. Hunters glance only briefly, too tired for myth, thinking instead of the next day's necessity. And yet, each one is bound by the light. The aurora has no single meaning. It is guide, spirit, companion, and silent witness all at once. It is worth pausing here to consider what monotony truly meant in this world. The daily tasks were repetitive, almost unchanging. Hunt, prepare, ration, repair, wait. To an outsider, perhaps unbearably dull. To those who lived it, these repetitions were sacred. Each act was both memory and future, proof that life continued. The aurora's repetition mirrored their own. Night after night, the same dance above. As if the sky itself affirmed the rhythm of their survival. But monotony was never safe. The ice could crack. A blizzard could erase the trail. A week of empty hunts could drain the camp's stores. Even the aurora, sometimes bright enough to read by, could shift into unfamiliar colors, unsettling those who relied on its constancy. Myths were born in those moments, stories of danger, warnings from the ancestors. Perhaps they were only interpretations of atmospheric science, but perhaps, too, they served as early lessons, reminders never to trust fully in what seems unchanging. And what of those who died on the hunt? Every hunter knew it was possible. A wrong step, a sudden crack, a storm that lasted too long. In such times, the aurora took on new meaning. Camps would say the lights were the souls of the lost, carried high above, still dancing in the sky. For those left behind, such stories softened grief. They suggested that the hunter's watch continued not below, but above, guiding those who still lived. The aurora, then, was not only a tool of orientation, it was a keeper of memory. Each time the lights rippled, people recalled not just the sky, but their ancestors, their traditions, their endless efforts to live. Survival was not only physical, but also emotional. And the aurora borealis carried both roles, compass and comfort, direction and remembrance. We, in our modern time, might look at satellite images, maps glowing with lines of latitude and longitude. We think ourselves advanced, but for the Inuit hunter, crouched on the ice beneath a flickering sky, the knowledge carried in memory and myth was just as precise. The aurora may not have given him coordinates, but it gave him a sense of belonging in a vast emptiness. Now imagine the end of the season, spring slowly returning, the sun rising higher. The aurora fades, less frequent, less bright. The hunter notices the change. The long dark of winter is lifting, but with it, the familiar lights withdraw, as though retreating to a hidden place. Life continues, but differently. Rivers thaw, animals migrate, new hunts begin. Still, the memory of the aurora remains, tied forever to the endless nights of winter, waiting. In the final reflection, one sees how boring details create survival. The hunter never relied on excitement. He relied on routine. He relied on knowing when to walk, when to wait, how to listen to the dogs, how to stitch clothing, how to ration oil. And through it all, the aurora watched, a constant reminder that life itself is repetition, illuminated by quiet light. And so we leave the hunter and his camp beneath the northern sky. The aurora continues to flicker, silent and steady, long after the hunter closes his eyes in sleep. Its light does not answer questions directly, it only glows. And perhaps that is the lesson. Survival is not found in certainty, but in patience, in memory, in small acts repeated, and in the quiet companionship of the world above. But one question lingers, even now, when the aurora danced brightest, did the hunter truly follow it, or did it simply walk beside him, silent and indifferent? Was it guide, or was it only light? That is where this story rests, unresolved, between guidance and mystery, between survival and symbolism, between what we know and what we only imagine. If you were to step into the Forbidden City during the Ming Dynasty, during a battle, not during a coronation, but simply on a day when a banquet was being prepared, you would not find excitement so much as endurance. Banquets were not single meals. They were long cycles of planning, cooking, waiting, and serving that unfolded with as much patience as a season of farming. To understand such a feast, you must first picture the scale of the palace. Red walls stretching endlessly, tiled roofs gleaming under the sun, courtyards wide enough to march armies through. Inside these spaces, the work of feeding the emperor and his court stretched like a river with no end. Hundreds of cooks, stewards, attendants, and cleaners moved slowly through their routines. Each task was small, boring in its repetition, but together they created the enormity of a Ming banquet. The starting point was not the emperor's hunger, but the records. Imperial officials kept lists upon lists, scrolls of ingredients required, tallies of animals slaughtered, notes of which province had sent which tribute. The arrival of a single shipment of dried fish from the coast could be recorded, sealed, and placed in archives. A sack of rice carried from the Yangtze Basin was measured not only by weight, but by who delivered it and when. The feast began not in the kitchen, but in the accounts, and then came the market within the palace itself. Storerooms filled with preserved foods, dried mushrooms from the mountains, salted ducks, bamboo shoots, and endless sacks of rice. Jars of soy sauce, aged until the liquid turned almost black. Vinegars sharp enough to sting the nose. Oils pressed from sesame, peanuts, or soybeans. Nothing could be used casually. Each jar had a place. Each scoop of rice had to be recorded. Stewards checked the ledgers again and again, fearing punishment if even a spoonful went unaccounted. From there, the preparations spread outward. Live animals were kept within palace compounds: pigs, chickens, ducks, and sometimes deer. Fish swam in tanks of fresh water, waiting to be slaughtered. Some would be carved immediately, but others were fed carefully until the exact day of the feast, ensuring that the emperor ate only the freshest meat. Attendants spent hours doing nothing but carrying buckets of water to keep the fish alive. And then there were the spices. For many, spices were treasures worth wars. For the Ming palace, they were routine. Peppercorns from the south, star anise, cinnamon bark, dried tangerine peel, ginger, both fresh and dried. Each had to be prepared correctly. Pepper was ground by hand, cinnamon shaved slowly, ginger sliced thinly into strips. No machine did this work. It was hands, knives, and endless hours of small, repetitive motions. Now picture the kitchen itself. Not a single room, but a network of them. Large halls with smoke rising from dozens of stoves. Pots so big that a man could stand inside them. Fires tended constantly, fed with wood carried by attendants whose entire duty was only to chop, stack, and feed flames. The sound was not loud, no clattering pans or shouts, but steady. The crackle of firewood, the bubbling of soup, the rhythmic chopping of knives on wooden blocks. The food prepared was not for taste alone. Each dish had symbolic meaning. A whole fish for abundance, dumplings shaped like ingots for wealth, lotus roots sliced to show their many holes, symbolizing openness and purity. The emperor did not merely eat, he displayed his power through food, showing that the resources of the entire empire flowed into his bowl. But before the emperor could taste a single bite, the food passed through layers of inspection. Tasters sampled every dish to ensure it was not poisoned. Stewards checked the presentation, the alignment of plates, the arrangement of colors. The placement of a dish on the table was not random, it was dictated by hierarchy, with certain dishes closer to the emperor and others farther away, depending on their importance. Even the boring detail of where a bowl was set could carry weight, for a misplaced plate could be read as disrespect. The cooks themselves rarely saw the emperor. They worked for days, then passed their dishes forward, never receiving direct praise or blame. The banquet was not their performance, but the court's, a long ritual where each gesture mattered more than the food itself. And what of the attendants who carried the dishes? They had to walk with slow, steady steps. No rushing, no noise, no spilled broth. Their movements were rehearsed, like dancers in a silent play. A dropped bowl was not just clumsiness, it could be a disaster, even a crime. By the time the banquet reached the emperor, hours, even days, had passed in preparation. Dishes were set before him in waves, one after another, until the table overflowed. The emperor himself might taste little, nibbling here, sipping there, often leaving most untouched. But the point was not his hunger. The point was abundance itself, the display of power through excess. The courtiers and officials seated nearby were more eager. For them, the banquet was both opportunity and burden. To eat at the emperor's table was an honor, but it was also exhausting. Course after course arrived, each to be sampled, praised, and swallowed. Bowls of rice, platters of fish, roasted meats, soups rich with spices, dumplings in delicate broths, cakes of sticky rice, fruits preserved in honey. To refuse was impolite, but to eat everything was impossible. And so they chewed slowly, forcing down morsels, nodding in appreciation, all the while waiting for the endless stream of dishes to stop. But it rarely stopped quickly. Some records suggest that imperial banquets could contain over 100 dishes, sometimes more. The meal might last hours, with attendants moving in and out, replacing bowls, refilling cups of wine. Even when the diners were exhausted, the ritual continued. Wine itself carried rules. Cups had to be filled and drained at the correct times, in rhythm with toasts and ceremonies. Drinking too quickly was shameful. Drinking too slowly was disrespectful. The warmth of alcohol spread through the court, but the tension of etiquette kept everyone stiff. Even as the aurora guided the Inuit hunter, here etiquette guided the courtier, invisible rules shaping every motion. Outside the hall, the kitchens did not rest. As the emperor ate, more food was prepared. Attendants stood ready to replace a dish at the slightest signal. Fires burned constantly, smoke drifting into the night sky. The cooks were not guests of the feast, but prisoners of it, tied to their stations, waiting for the cycle to repeat, and all the while records were kept. How much rice used, how many ducks roasted, how many jars of wine emptied. Even abundance had to be measured. A feast was never truly free. It was a ledger written in flavors. Here we pause, at the midpoint of the Banquets story. You might imagine the emperor leaning back, the courtiers weary, the attendants still carrying dishes with careful steps. The feast has not yet ended. Outside, in storerooms, more food waits, fires burn low, knives still chop. Tomorrow, another banquet may come, but one must wonder, did anyone at these endless tables truly taste the food? Or was the banquet itself the meal, a ritual of power where flavor was less important than form? When we think of a banquet, we imagine eating, but to the Ming court, eating was only the surface. Beneath it lay a machinery of people, supplies, and ritual that turned food into an endless current, flowing from storerooms to kitchens to tables and back again. If you were a common servant in the palace kitchens, your life was not measured in years or even in seasons, it was measured in meals. The great banquets were markers of time, like the sun rising and setting. One ended, and already another began. The day after a feast, the remains of the previous night's abundance had to be cleared. Dishes scraped, bones carried away, leftovers sorted. Nothing could be discarded carelessly. Some scraps fed palace animals, some were dried for storage, some perhaps distributed quietly among lower servants. Even the waste was counted. To live in the palace was to live in a world where nothing escaped the eye of the record keeper. And then, with barely a pause, new preparations began. Caravans of ingredients arrived through the palace gates, each load inspected carefully. From the south came crates of sugar, from the north carts of wheat, from the coast baskets of shellfish packed in wet seaweed. The empire was vast, and the emperor's table reflected it. These deliveries did not appear magically at the forbidden city gates. They began months earlier, in farms and fishing villages, where tribute was demanded. A farmer harvesting lotus roots in a muddy pond might never see Beijing, yet his crop was destined for an imperial soup. A fisherman pulling in his nets near the coast might mutter a complaint, knowing the best of his catch was not for his family, but for the distant emperor. In this way, the Ming banquets stretched their influence far beyond the palace walls, reaching into every province. Inside the forbidden city, the storage alone was its own miniature kingdom. Cooks knew their way through warehouses stacked high with rice sacks, dried sea cucumbers, strings of garlic, and baskets of ginger. Stewards checked seals of wax on each container, making sure no hand had stolen so much as a handful of grain. Walking through the stores was like moving through a library of food, rows of shelves, carefully labeled, each item both nourishment and symbol. Meanwhile, in the kitchens, the rhythms repeated. Knives struck chopping boards with the steadiness of water dripping into a basin. Dough was kneaded, folded, filled with meats and vegetables, then steamed in towers of bamboo baskets. Chickens were boiled and skinned until their flesh gleamed pale and smooth, ready for seasoning. Fish were filleted with precision so that the bones seemed to vanish, leaving only flesh arranged like silk ribbons on a plate. Each task was small, unremarkable on its own, but multiplied by hundreds of cooks, repeated day after day, the effect was vast. The kitchens were less like a place of joy and more like a factory, though no one at the time would have used such a word. The smell of the kitchens was its own endless story. Wood smoke, rich oils, the sharpness of vinegar, the sweetness of honey, the earthiness of boiling roots. For workers inside, the smell was constant, clinging to clothes and hair until they no longer noticed it. Outside, attendants carrying dishes through palace corridors trailed faint clouds of scent, like invisible banners announcing the progress of food. And yet, despite all this effort, the emperor himself might only nibble. He had the right to abundance, but not necessarily the appetite for it. Some emperors were gluttonous, eating greedily. Others were restrained, tasting little. But regardless of personal hunger, the machine of banquets continued. The show could not stop at the tables of officials and guests. The experience was more exhausting than delightful. The endless courses tested the endurance of the body. To eat steadily, politely, over hours was as much a duty as bowing or writing memorials to the throne. Some officials became skilled at moving food around their plates, appearing to eat more than they did. Others whispered that survival at a banquet required more stamina than survival on campaign. Wine was both relief and burden. It eased stiff manners, but also dulled the senses. And yet it was poured. To decline too much was risky. To drink too much was foolish. And so men drank with careful restraint, balancing their heads between clarity and intoxication. Meanwhile, musicians played in the background, soft strings, bamboo flutes, drums beaten at slow rhythms. The music was meant to soothe, but it also filled the silences that grew heavy when men grew too weary to converse. Banquets were as much about waiting as about waiting for the next dish, the next toast, the next signal from the emperor. Behind the walls, the hidden labor continued. Fires had to be kept alive all night. Water had to be carried, buckets sloshing in steady lines from wells to kitchens. Attendants polished plates, wiped chopsticks, folded cloths. None of it glamorous, all of it necessary. The banquets were endless, not because the eating was infinite, but because the work behind them never truly stopped. It is easy to imagine the emperor at the center, presiding over abundance. But in truth, the real heart of the banquet was elsewhere, in the sweating kitchens, the heavy storerooms, the ledgers where numbers were scratched down in ink. Abundance was not a taste, it was a system, a quiet machinery that swallowed labor and spat out dishes until the court was full. And when the last guests departed, when the music ceased and the tables were cleared, the palace did not rest. The cycle had already begun again. Another emperor, another occasion, another endless feast. Perhaps the strangest thing about these banquets was how little joy they contained. For the cooks, it was toil. For the officials, it was etiquette. For the emperor, it was performance. And yet they continued, and again, like waves on a shore, they came without end. By now, you have followed the banquet from the bright halls of the forbidden city to the dim storerooms, from the ritual gestures of the emperor to the quiet toil of the cooks. But the story of these endless feasts does not end with a single meal, or even with the reign of one emperor. Instead, it is a story about time itself, about how the Ming Dynasty used food as both a promise and a burden, and how abundance slowly grew heavier than scarcity ever had. For the emperor, Banquets were a declaration. They announced that he was the Son of Heaven, chosen by mandate to rule. To feed hundreds of officials with delicacies gathered from the corners of the empire was proof that the empire was intact, abundant, and ordered. To eat well was to confirm that the world itself was in balance. But for the officials seated at those tables, the message was not always reassuring. Each dish was a reminder of the emperor's power. Each toast a signal of dependence. A man might build his career over decades, studying Confucian texts, passing examinations, serving in distant provinces. Yet, at a single banquet, his position could be shaken by the emperor's frown, by a careless word after too much wine, by a rival's well-placed compliment. The food was rich, but the air was heavy. For the servants and cooks, banquets were both livelihood and exhaustion. A boy entering the kitchens at age 10 might spend his entire life there, never once stepping into the hall where his food was served. He might grow old among steaming pots, his hands cracked by hot water, his back bent from carrying trays. To him, the banquets were not performances of power, but an endless cycle of labor. And when he died, another would take his place, and the rhythm would continue. Beyond the palace walls, the banquets rippled outward. Farmers in Jiangnan harvested rice, not just for their families, but for imperial granaries. Fishermen near the coast set aside the largest catches for tribute. Merchants transported spices, sugar, and dried fruits to Beijing, knowing the best of their goods would never reach the common markets. For them, the banquets were distant and abstract, but their effects were real. The emperor's table was built on their labor, and though they might never see it, they felt its pull. This was the hidden paradox of abundance. To maintain endless banquets, the Ming court had to demand more labor, more food, more tribute, and yet the more it demanded, the more fragile it became. A bad harvest in one province meant thinner stores in Beijing. A disruption in trade meant fewer delicacies to serve. Abundance was not simply wealth. It was a balance, carefully maintained, always at risk. Historians often note that the Ming Dynasty, especially in its later years, became trapped by ritual. The emperor could not stop holding banquets, just as he could not stop staging rituals, writing edicts, or appearing in ceremonies. To stop was to admit weakness, to allow the illusion of heavenly order to falter. And so, even when the treasury strained, even when the empire grew restless, the banquets continued. At times, the excess became almost surreal. Records tell of feasts where hundreds of dishes were prepared, far more than any group could possibly consume. Food piled upon food until the table itself seemed to sag. And yet, this was not waste, but ritual necessity. To serve too little would be shameful. To serve too much was expected. There is a stillness in this repetition, a strange kind of boredom. Imagine sitting through the 10th course, the 20th, the 30th. The flavors blur together. The conversation grows heavy. The mind wanders. Officials sometimes described the banquets in their diaries, not as delights, but as burdens. They longed to return home, to eat simple rice in quiet, to escape the endless cycle of dishes. And yet they came when summoned, because absence could mean disgrace. The banquets, then, were not just about food, they were about control. By gathering his officials at endless feasts, the emperor ensured their presence, their obedience, their wariness. He showed them the empire's wealth, while reminding them of their dependence on his favor. To eat at his table was both an honor and a chain. But history moves in cycles, and abundance is never permanent. As the Ming dynasty weakened in the 17th century, with rebellions spreading and silver shortages straining the treasury, the endless banquets grew harder to sustain. Tribute shipments were delayed, storehouses emptied. Cooks found themselves with fewer ingredients to transform into abundance. Still, the ritual continued, even as the empire frayed. When the dynasty finally collapsed, swept away by internal unrest and external invasion, the banquets did not save it. The halls fell silent, the kitchens went cold, the storerooms emptied. For a time, the echo of abundance lingered. But then even that faded. What remains today are records ledgers of food delivered, lists of dishes served, diaries of weary officials. In their details, we glimpse the strange truth that the Ming dynasty, one of the most powerful empires in Chinese history, sustained itself not only with armies and taxes, but with an endless cycle of meals. And so we return to the question, what does it mean to feast without end? Is it proof of strength, or a mask for fragility? Is abundance a gift, or a weight too heavy to carry? The Ming banquets remind us that history is not always dramatic battles or sudden events. Sometimes it is slow, repetitive, and heavy. Sometimes it is measured in dishes, in courses, in the steady rhythm of kitchens that never rest, and perhaps in their endlessness. These feasts tell us something about all empires, that power often hides in rituals, that abundance can become routine, and that even the most sumptuous banquet eventually grows cold. If you step into a monastery of the past, stone walls, narrow corridors, a courtyard swept clean of leaves, you will notice first not the sound of chanting, nor the flicker of lamps, but something else, the stillness of time itself. The monks who lived there gave up much of the outside world. They lived apart from markets and politics, far from the noise of cities. Yet they did not abandon time. On the contrary, they cared for it with more attention than most emperors, merchants, or kings ever could in these monasteries. Centuries before mechanical clocks spread widely, monks kept order in their lives, not by bells struck at random, but by measurements of sand, water, and stone. For them, each grain slipping through a glass, or each drop falling into a basin, was not just a sign of passing minutes. It was a thread woven into prayer, labor, and silence. Sand was one of their simplest companions. In some monasteries, you might find sand-gloss wooden frames holding 2 bulbs of glass, with a narrow passage between them. Sand poured through slowly, evenly, in a way that seemed gentle, almost hypnotic. A monk assigned to the task would watch, waiting for the last grains to fall. Then he would turn the glass over again, and the cycle would begin anew. The turning of a sandglass was never dramatic. It was not a striking of a bell across a valley, but a small, steady act, repeated with patience. Yet it shaped the hours. It told the monks when to rise for midnight prayers, when to gather in the chapel, when to begin their labor in gardens or script or IUMS. All monasteries used sand. Some measured time with water clocks, vessels where water dripped slowly from one container to another. The sound of drops in the stillness of a stone hall was its own kind of music. Each drop marked a fragment of life, quiet, unnoticed, but faithful. And then there were stones. Not the grand stones of cathedrals or towers, but small pebbles kept in bowls or pouches. A monk counting prayers might move one stone at a time, each movement marking a cycle of devotion. Some monasteries used these stones almost like beads, others as counters for repeated tasks. Stone by stone, time became tangible, something to hold in the hand. Imagine sitting in the cool air of an early morning chapel. The light has not yet reached the high windows. Around you, the monks breathe quietly, their robes rustling as they kneel. Somewhere in the corner of the room, a sandglass waits, its grains falling steadily. When the last grain drops, a monk silently rises and flips it over. No words are spoken, but all know what it means. Another measure of time has passed. Life in the monastery was measured not by grand events, but by these small signals. Meals, prayers, and labor followed one another with gentle repetition. To live there was to surrender to the rhythm of sand, water, and stone. It is tempting to think of this as boring, and in a sense, it was. But boredom here was not an enemy, it was a companion. It created a steady background against which prayer could deepen, labor could focus, and thought could settle. In the silence, the smallest sounds became clear. A grain of sand striking glass, a drop of water echoing in a bowl. These monks, with their simple tools, remind us that time itself has many textures. It can rush like a river, or crawl like a snail. But in their world, time was measured evenly, gently, without haste, and so, stone by stone, grain by grain, the hours moved, not with drama, but with patience. Yet this raises a question. How did these fragile instruments of sand and water survive in an age when so much was uncertain? And why did men devote their lives to guarding such quiet rhythms when outside their walls kingdoms rose and fell? Time, for the monks, was not an abstraction. It was the very fabric of their lives. To live in a monastery was to live in a world ruled less by seasons and more by hours, hours carefully measured, arranged, and repeated like bricks in a wall. From the outside, one might think that life behind cloister walls was simple. The monks prayed, they ate, they worked. Yet, if you walked their corridors, you would find a life as precise as the inner workings of a clock. And in fact, before the invention and spread of mechanical clocks, the monasteries were the places where the concept of measured time was kept alive, sometimes quite literally, by hand. The day began before the sun. In the deep hours of night, long before a rooster crowed, a sandglass might be turned, or a water clock checked. A monk, assigned to the duty of custos, horum-keeper of the hours, rose, quietly, lit a small lamp, and watched. His job was not glamorous. He did not teach, he did not lead prayers, he did not copy books. His task was to guard time itself. When the grains of sand fell, or when the water reached a marked level, he would sound the signal, sometimes a soft bell, sometimes the clapper of wood on stone. The sound echoed through the halls, stirring others from their sleep. In silence, the community gathered in the chapel, robes swishing, bare feet whispering across cold floors. Midnight prayers began, their voices filling the dark with chant. Then, once again, the day unfolded. Each activity was assigned its portion of time: morning prayers, reading, meals taken in silence, work in the fields or the gardens, tending vegetables that would be eaten weeks later. Some monks labored in scriptoriums, bent over parchment, copying words letter by letter, pausing only when the sandglass ran empty. The precision of this rhythm was not simply practical, it was spiritual. To measure time was to sanctify it, to remind oneself that each hour belonged not to human whim, but to divine order. A monk did not ask, "What shall I do today?" The answer was already given, divided into blocks of sand and stone. Meals themselves were measured with the same care. In many monasteries, the food was plain bread, porridge, broth. Yet the timing of meals mattered as much as the food. To eat too early was indulgence. To eat too late was disorder. When the appointed measure of sand had fallen, the bell rang, and the monks entered the refectory. They ate in silence, sometimes listening to a brother read aloud from scripture or history. Even eating was part of the rhythm, a continuation of prayer by other means. But not all moments were solemn. In gardens and fields, monks sometimes found relief in the steady rhythm of labor, digging soil, planting seeds, pulling weeds, all done in measured time. To an outsider, this might look monotonous, yet for the monks, the repetition was a form of freedom. Their minds, unburdened by choice, could drift toward contemplation. The sandglass did not rush them, nor did it linger. It simply measured enough. In the scriptorium, the rhythm of time-shaped words themselves. A monk might copy a psalm while watching the sand fall beside him. He knew that by the time the last grains had passed, he should have filled so many lines. His writing was not hurried, not slow, but steady. Over months and years, stone by stone, page by page, entire libraries were built by this rhythm. There was also discipline in this system. If a monk arrived late to prayer, it was clear that he had failed to heed the measured hours. If he lingered over food, he disturbed the balance. The monotony was not an accident, it was a structure, one that taught humility and obedience. Time itself became the teacher. Even seasons were filtered through this steady rhythm. In winter, the air in the cloisters was sharp with cold, and water sometimes froze in the bowls of the clocks, forcing monks to warm them by the fire. In summer, the sand grew hot to the touch, and sweat dampened the robes of those waiting through long hours. Yet, regardless of season, the cycle continued. The sun might rise earlier or later, but the hours within the monastery were constant. To live this way required patience, but it also produced a kind of quiet strength. The monks did not fight against time, nor did they rush it. They accepted it, measured it, and folded themselves into its flow. To modern eyes, their life might seem unbearably dull, but to them it was freedom from distraction. What emerges from this quiet rhythm is a strange truth, that by surrendering to measured hours, the monks gained a sense of control. They shaped their lives not by chance or by impulse, but by the steady fall of sand. Each day was both the same and new, each hour both ordinary and sacred, and so their lives became, quite literally, built of time. Sandglass turned upon sandglass, water drop upon water drop, stone upon stone. The monastery was less a building of stone walls than a building of hours, carefully stacked, never hurried, never missed, But this raises another thought. Was there danger in this endless measurement? Could a life so rigid, so bound to grains of sand and counted stones, become too narrow, too mechanical? Could the monks, in their devotion to measured hours, lose sight of time's deeper flows, seasons of change, the unpredictability of life beyond the cloister walls? The sand has been falling for centuries, though the hands that turned the glass are long gone. The stones once moved carefully from one bowl to another lie scattered now, their meaning forgotten. The water that dripped in the silence of cloisters has dried. And yet, the rhythm those monks guarded, they steady division of life into our still beats within us. What remains most striking about their world is not simply the instruments themselves, but the patience they demanded. To sit in the stillness of a hall and wait for grains of sand to fall requires trust. To measure one's day not by personal desire, but by the slow dripping of water, requires surrender. These monks gave up control, not in order to lose themselves, but to find a deeper order within. Their measured time was more than discipline, it was identity. To be a monk was not simply to wear a robe, chant prayers, or labor in gardens. It was to live inside a structure of hours so precise that it became invisible, like the air around them. The rhythm carried them from birth to death, from one season to the next. And yet, there is something fragile about it. For all its stability, their system was vulnerable. A cracked sandglass, a frozen water bowl, a distracted keeper of any of these could disrupt the order. Time, though carefully measured, was always just one accident away from slipping into chaos. The monks must have known this, and perhaps it kept them humble. No matter how carefully they measured, they did not command time. They could only observe it, grain by grain. In the centuries that followed, mechanical clocks spread, first in towers, then in towns, then in homes. The loud strike of a bell replaced the whisper of sand. Time grew louder, sharper, more public. It became something to announce, not just something to keep. Soon, cities and kingdoms moved to the rhythm of clocks, and the quiet measures of the monastery seemed almost quaint. But perhaps that is why their story lingers. In an age when we are surrounded by clocks and walls, in pockets glowing on screen set, is easy to forget the texture of time. We count it, divide it, rush through it, yet rarely pause to hear it. The monks remind us that time can be soft, slow, and almost imperceptible. That life can be measured not only in appointments and deadlines, but in grains, drops, and stones. It is also worth noting how much these boring hours shaped history. Without the steady labor of monks, measured by sand and water, countless manuscripts would not have been copied. Gardens would not have been tended with such care. Music and chant would not have filled stone halls with their patterned rhythm. The very preservation of knowledge in the so-called dark centuries of Europe depended on men who lived by the humblest measures of time. Their discipline, built of boredom and patience, sustained not only their lives but the memory of cultures. Stone by stone, line by line, hour by hour, they passed knowledge forward. Yet, perhaps the greatest lesson is more intimate. The monks remind us that time is not only something to chase, but something to hold lightly. That hours are not enemies, but companions. That silence, repetition, and even monotony can be fertile ground for meaning. That as you think of Thembent over manuscripts, moving pebbles, Listening to drops of water, you might wonder, in a world where we try to fill every moment, could there be wisdom in letting some moments simply pass? Could the slow falling of grains, boring and steady, be a kind of prayer even today? The monks never answered this in words. They answered it. Their lives were their answer, measured hour by hour. And so, though the sandglasses have stopped, their rhythm continues. In every clock that ticks, in every schedule we keep, we live within their legacy. But the question remains, do we remember the silence beneath the ticking? Imagine a landscape in the medieval world, not of castles and knights, but of small enclosures, bounded by low stone walls or wooden fences. Within these boundaries, there is a scatter of tree sapples, pears, cherries, plums standing quietly in the earth. These are orchards, places where time moved at a pace so slow that only the most patient could see the reward. The story of medieval orchards is not one of sudden triumphs, but of waiting. To plant a tree was to make a promise not to oneself, but to the future. A sapling placed into the ground might not bear fruit for 5, 10, or even 15 years. The planter often knew that the best harvests would come long after his own hands were gone. Orchard keeping, therefore, was a slow kind of faith, belief that tomorrow, and the generations after tomorrow, would still be there to enjoy what the earth had offered. Those guardians of silence and steady labor became famous for their orchards. In the cloister gardens, monks set aside spaces for herbs and vegetables, but always there were rows of apple, fig, or nut trees that would outlast the men who planted them. A monk might spend his entire lifetime tending the same orchard, pruning branches each spring, training limbs against wooden stakes, or watching carefully for blight. He would rarely taste the full abundance his work had prepared, but he continued year after year, as though each cut and each season was part of a greater rhythm beyond his own. The orchard was, in many ways, a mirror of the monastery itself, slow to grow, quiet in appearance, but deeply fruitful over time. In Scripture, trees were symbols of endurance, wisdom, and paradise restored. To plant one was not simply an act of agriculture, but of devotion. Each fruit-bearing tree was a living sermon teaching patience, humility, and the mysterious way that small beginnings could yield abundance. Outside the monastery walls, peasants and villagers also cultivated orchards, though on a humbler scale. An apple tree might grow beside a cottage, or a row of plum trees might border a field. In times when grain harvests were uncertain and winters long, the fruit of an orchard could mean survival. Apples could be dried, pears could be stored in cool cellars, cherries could be preserved in honey, and plums could be fermented into wine or brandy. A good orchard was not simply a luxuriate with security, a kind of insurance against the hunger that too often stalked medieval lives. And yet, the orchard was not only about necessity, it was also about pleasure. A ripe pear, eaten fresh in the shade of its tree, was a sweetness that broke the monotony of bread and broth. A jug of cider shared among neighbors was not only drink, but celebration. Medieval people, for all their hardships, cherished the taste of fruit, and orchards provided it in quiet abundance. There is something striking in how much care went into these places of slow reward. Orchard keeping demanded labor digging holes, hauling water, protecting saplings from grazing animals. and pruning branches with precision. It demanded knowledge too, when to graft, when to harvest, how to store. Much of this knowledge was passed down by word of mouth, from fathers to sons, from monks to novices, like the trees themselves, passed from one generation to the next. And yet, for all this effort, the orchard asked for something more than labor or knowledge. It asked for patience. A farmer could plow his field in spring and reap his wheat in autumn, but the orchard moved on a timescale far slower. A man could plant a seedling as a young adult and see it only just coming into fruit as his hair began to gray. The orchard's gifts came not to those who hurried, but to those willing to wait. It is this slowness that gives the medieval orchard its peculiar atmosphere. Imagine walking into such a place, the air thick with the smell of earth, bees humming from blossom to blossom, the ground dappled with shadows. Around you, trees rise at different stages, some young and fragile, others old and heavy with fruit. There is no noise of urgency here, no sound of rushing feet, only the steady rhythm of nature, unfolding year after year. Unconcerned with human haste, the orchard became a setting for memory. A child might climb the same tree his grandfather had planted. Lovers might meet beneath branches that had shaded generations before them. A monk, copying scripture by candlelight, might pause to sip cider made from apples harvested by monks who had died centuries earlier. The orchard connected lives, not through battle or politics, but through the quiet continuity of growth. In medieval literature, trees often stood as metaphors for human lives rooted in earth, stretching toward heaven, fruitful in their season, barren in their decline. An orchard was, then, a kind of collective portrait of humanity. Some trees young, some old, some thriving, some withered. To walk among them was to walk through a living allegory, a sermon preached without words. Yet the orchard was not always idyllic. Storms could strip blossoms in a single night. Disease could hollow the trunks of trees that had taken decades to mature. A hungry army could trample an orchard in its march, undoing in hours what had taken half a century to grow. Orchards were vulnerable, fragile, reminders that patience could still be met with loss. Perhaps that is why their survival feels all the more precious. Every orchard that endured was a small victory of persistence against time and chance. Stone by stone, monks built walls to protect their orchards from cattle. Year by year, peasants pruned branches to keep them fruitful. Generation by generation, families preserved grafts to keep a line of trees alive. The orchard became not only a source of food, but a symbol of rootedness, of continuity in a world that so often felt uncertain. And so, when we picture medieval Europe, perhaps we should not imagine only castles and cathedrals, banners and battles. Perhaps we should also imagine orchards, the slow, steady growth of trees tended by hands that knew they were working for futures they might never see. If you were to live beside a medieval orchard for a full year, you would come to know that its life was not still, but rhythmic. The orchard moved through the seasons, as surely as the monks rang their bells at dawn, or peasants tilled their strips of land. Each month brought its own tasks, its own quiet transformations, its own demands on patience. Spring was the orchard's most delicate time, after the long gray months of winter. When the branches stood bare against the sky, the trees began to stir. Buds swelled, blossoms opened, and the orchard seemed to exhale life once more. Monks and peasants alike would walk the rows with careful eyes, watching for frost. A sudden, cold night in April could kill the blossoms, leaving the year's harvest barren before it had even begun. Some records speak of men staying awake through the night, kindling small fires near their trees, hoping the rising smoke would ward off frost and save the fragile flowers. It was in spring, too, that grafting often took place. Grafting was a patient and delicate craft, by which a cutting from one tree was spliced onto another. This ensured that the fruit of a favored variety could be reproduced, rather than leaving it to the chance of seed. Grafting required a steady hand, a knowledge of sap flow, and trust in nature's slow knitting of living wood to living wood. In monasteries, this was as much a spiritual exercise as an agricultural one, to bind one thing to another, to coax continuity from fragility. Spring was also the time when bees returned to their work. The hum of hives echoed through orchards, for without bees there would be little fruit. Monks often kept hives beside their trees, knowing that honey was not only a sweetener, but a preservative, a medicine, even a symbol in Scripture. The bees worked with the trees in a silent partnership, one that people depended upon but could barely control. By summer, the orchard grew heavy with promise. The blossoms gave way to fruit, first small and green, then swelling as the sun lingered longer in the sky. Children might slip among the rows to pluck an early apple or a handful of cherries, though too many green fruits could bring a stomachache. Summer was also a time of vigilance. Insects might gnaw at leaves, storms might snap branches, drought might leave trees thirsty. A summer of neglect could undo years of careful tending. Still, summer in the orchard carried a sense of abundance. The air was scented with ripening fruit, and shade beneath the trees became a refuge for laborers from the heat. It was in summer that peasants might dream of what autumn would bring: baskets filled with pears, barrels filled with cider, storerooms lined with dried fruit to see them through the winter. Then came autumn, the season of reward. The orchard transformed into a place of gathering. Families, monks, and hired hands alike took part in the harvest. Ladders were leaned against branches, baskets were filled, and wagons creaked under the weight of apples and pears. For a few weeks, the quiet patience of years burst into activity. Songs were sometimes sung, children chased after fallen fruit, and the orchard became a place of work and celebration combined. Not all fruit was consumed at once. Some was eaten fresh, of course, but much of it was stored or transformed. Apples could be dried in ovens, sliced thin and preserved for months. Pears might be carefully packed in straw and kept in cool cellars. Plums could be boiled into jams or fermented into strong drink. And, perhaps most importantly, apples and pears could be pressed into juice and left to ferment into cider and perry. Drinks that would sustain communities when water was unsafe and ale ran low. Autumn was also the time for planting. The best seeds were saved for planting. The strongest grafts were noted, and the cycle of patience began again. Every harvest was both an ending and a beginning, a reminder that the orchard's life was circular, not linear. Finally, winter arrived. The orchard stood bare, its branches stark against snow or fog. To an unknowing eye, it might have seemed lifeless. But winter was a season of hidden work. Roots burrowed deeper, sap retreated, the trees rested. For people to winter in the orchard was a time of quieter tasks, pruning branches, cutting firewood from dead limbs, repairing fences or walls. The orchard was silent, but not forgotten. In fact, winter was when the patience of orchard keepers was most visible. They continued to tend trees that looked asleep, trusting that life would return in spring. This rhythm: blossom, growth, harvest, rest was repeated year after year, century after century. It was steady, unhurried, and almost imperceptible to anyone seeking quick results. To live with orchards was to learn to measure time differently, not in days or weeks, but in seasons and decades. A man might remember the year when the frost ruined the blossoms, or the summer when the drought shriveled the fruit, or the autumn when the harvest was so plentiful that cider overflowed from the barrels. These memories became markers of life, intertwined with the orchard's slow pulse. It is worth noting how different this rhythm was from the urgency of political history. Kings rose and fell, battles were fought and forgotten, laws were written and rewritten, but in the orchard the blossoms returned each spring, whether a new king sat on the throne or not. The orchard moved at a pace indifferent to human ambition. That was part of its comfort. No matter the turmoil beyond its walls, the orchard endured. Yet endurance required care. Without pruning, trees grew wild. Without protection, animals stripped bark and branches. Without patience, fruit was wasted. The orchard was a collaboration between human persistence and natural cycles. It was not fully in human hands, but neither was it entirely beyond them. In this balance lay its quiet wisdom. Some chroniclers noted the symbolic weight of the orchard's seasons. Spring, they said, was like youth, fragile, hopeful, full of possibility. Summer was like maturity, strong, productive, full of work. Autumn was like old age, harvest, wisdom, a gathering of fruits. Winter was like death, or, perhaps better, like rest, the sleep that prepares for renewal. To walk through the orchard was to walk through a reflection of life itself, written not in words but in branches and fruit. When we read these accounts, it is easy to forget how deeply ordinary people depended on such places. The orchard was not an ornament, but a necessity. Without it, winters were leaner, diets poorer, feasts less joyful. With it, there was sweetness, variety, preservation, and drink. The orchard was woven into the fabric of medieval survival as much as the plowland or the pasture. And so, as the seasons turned, the orchard stood steady year after year. It was not heroic. It was not dramatic. It was simply patient. And in that patience, it shaped lives. But one question lingers. In a world where hunger was common and survival uncertain, why did people commit so much time and labor to orchards, planting trees that would take years, even decades, to yield their best fruit? Was it only necessity, or was there something deeper, a sense of hope, of continuity, of trust in the future that drew people again and again to the slow growth of trees? When you look across the landscapes of Europe today, it is still possible to catch glimpses of the work begun in medieval times. An ancient pear tree leaning beside a village road, an apple variety known only to a small region, a gnarled plum whose roots have held the same soil for centuries. These are the remnants of orchards planted in an age when time moved differently. Their survival is not accidental, but a testament to the patience and persistence of those who first set them in the ground. The medieval orchard left its mark in ways both practical and symbolic. On the practical side, it introduced and preserved varieties of fruit that shaped diets for centuries. Many of the apples we know today sharp for cider, sweet for eating, firm for storing trace their lineage back to grafts carefully tended in monasteries or manorial estates. The same is true of pears, cherries, and plums, whose cultivation spread slowly but surely from cloister to village to city. The orchard was also a seedbed for knowledge. Monks, often among the most literate members of society, recorded their methods of grafting, pruning, and storage. Their notes, though modest, carried forward techniques that influenced horticulture long after their monasteries fell silent. By the Renaissance, orchard keeping had become a subject of study in itself, with manuals circulating among scholars and landowners. But the roots of this written knowledge lay in the patient, almost unnoticed work of medieval monks and peasants, who had experimented and observed over generations. Beyond its fruits and methods, the orchard shaped culture. In literature and art, it became a symbol of peace, plenty, and paradise. Medieval poets often used the orchard as a setting for reflection, love, or allegory. To step into an orchard was to enter a space apart from the world of toil and conflict. It was a place where time seemed to slow, where the senses could rest in the smell of blossoms or the taste of ripened fruit. Even today, when we speak of Eden or imagine paradise, we picture something like an orchard, trees heavy with fruit, shade beneath branches, sweetness ready to be shared. The orchard also played a role in community life. Harvests were rarely solitary. They were shared labor. Families, neighbors, and hired hands gathered together, and the work of filling baskets and barrels often ended in feasting. These moments built bonds as surely as they filled storerooms. To remember a good year's harvest was to remember not only the taste of fruit, but the company of those who gathered it. In this way, orchards were woven into the social fabric, not merely as sources of food, but as places of memory and fellowship. There is a certain irony in how fragile and enduring these orchards proved to be. Many were lost to war, disease, or neglect, yet enough endured that we can still taste their legacy. In the English countryside, for instance, cider orchards recall traditions that reach back to medieval monks. In parts of France, ancient pear varieties survive in the making of perry. In Central and Eastern Europe, plum orchards remain tied to the distillation of slivovitz, a spirit with centuries of history. Each of these drinks is more than refreshment, they are living connections to the medieval patience that nurtured the trees. Modern science has, in recent years, begun to rediscover the genetic wealth preserved in these old varieties. Heirloom apples and heritage plums are prized not only for their flavors, but for their resilience. Some withstand cold, others resist pests, others keep longer in storage. Each variety is a memory of what was once valued, carefully preserved through grafts and cuttings handed down across centuries. The medieval orchard, then, continues to feed us not just with fruit, but with genetic knowledge carried silently through time. But perhaps the orchard's greatest legacy is not in its fruits or its science, but in its lesson of time. In an age when life was short and uncertain, people still planted trees they knew they might never enjoy at their best. They worked for the sake of children not yet born, for feasts not yet tasted, for winters not yet endured. To plant an orchard was to trust that the world would go on, and that others would walk beneath the shade of trees you yourself had tended. This quiet trust was itself a form of resilience. Medieval life was filled with interruptions, war, famine, plague. Fields might be burned, houses abandoned, whole villages swept away, and yet orchards were planted and replanted, as though each act of digging a hole and pressing a sapling into the soil was a small defiance against uncertainty. Orchards endured because people needed them, but also because people hoped. Think of a monk in the 12th century grafting a branch to a sapling in a walled garden. He knew he might never live to see the fruit of his work, but he did it anyway. Think of a peasant planting an apple beside his cottage, knowing that his grandchildren might be the ones to rest beneath its shade. These are not dramatic acts. They are not recorded in chronicles of kings and battles, but they are the quiet foundation upon which centuries of life were built. When we wander through old villages or countryside lanes and stumble across a lone, ancient fruit tree, we are touching that same continuity. The tree may no longer be part of a tended orchard. Its companions may have vanished, but it stands as a reminder that someone long ago had patience, someone planted with faith in a future they could not see. There is, in that thought, a kind of comfort. History is often told through its loudest moments: wars, revolutions, discoveries. But the orchard tells us another story, that history is also made by slow growth, by patience, by quiet hands tending trees, season after season. The orchard whispers that much of what sustains us is not sudden, but gradual, not loud, but silent. And so, the legacy of the medieval orchard is more than fruit or tradition. It is a way of seeing time, a reminder that some of the most important things we inherit are not immediate, but the result of long patience. A reminder that our own lives, too, might bear fruit long after we are gone. Perhaps the orchard endures because it offers this reflection, that growth worth having is slow, that endurance is quiet, and that hope, even in the most uncertain times, can be planted root by root, tree by tree. And so we leave the orchard here, standing in its stillness, its blossoms and shadows, its fruit and silence, not dramatic, not hurried, but enduring. Stone walls may crumble, kings may fall, but the orchard remains emblem of patience, a gift to the future. When you picture the Ottoman Empire, perhaps you imagine sultans in their palaces, grand mosques rising above city skylines, or janissaries standing in disciplined ranks. Yet hidden beneath the glitter of courts and the thunder of armies was a quieter system, one that rarely appears in paintings or songs. The postmen of the empire, who carried letters and orders across distances so great that without them the empire might have dissolved into silence. The Ottomans inherited and expanded upon older traditions of communication. Long before them, the Persians had created the royal road. The Byzantines had their network of couriers. The Mongols their yam posts. The Ottomans building their dominion across 3 continents, stitched together their own system, a web of relay stations, horses and men who devoted their lives not to battle or trade, but to the steady, often thankless work of carrying messages. It began with roads. Ottoman roads were not always smooth, nor were they consistent, but certain routes became arteries of empire. From Istanbul, the capital, roads stretched outward toward Anatolia, the Balkans, the Levant, and beyond. Along these routes stood Menzohane relay stations built specifically for couriers. Each station was placed a day's ride, sometimes less, from the next. Here, a weary rider could dismount, deliver his pouch, and pass it to another who would continue the journey. Or, if no other courier awaited, he might change horses, snatch a few hours of rest, and ride again. The stations were modest places. Often they consisted of a stable, a storeroom, and a few rooms where couriers could sleep. They were not designed for comfort, but for continuity. Their purpose was not to house men in luxury, but to ensure that messages moved without interruption. Horses were the real treasures of the stations. Kept ready, fed, and watered, they were the engines of speed. A fresh horse could carry a courier further and faster, and so the empire invested in keeping its stations supplied. The men themselves, the forgotten postmen, lived lives of both hardship and obscurity. Their duty was not celebrated like that of soldiers, nor rewarded like that of merchants. They were expected to ride in all weathers, across mountains and deserts, through dangers of bandits or floods. Their pouches contained orders from sultans, reports from governors, petitions from villages, and sometimes the private letters of those wealthy enough to afford their service. To lose a pouch was unthinkable. The penalty could be severe, for a message delayed might mean a tax unpaid, a revolt unnoticed, or a battle lost. And yet, most of their journeys were not filled with drama. They were filled with monotony. Long miles of road, the steady rhythm of hooves, the feel of reins in hand, the weight of the pouch against the body. A courier might ride for days without event, his world reduced to the road ahead. The next station, the next horse, the next mile. It was boring work, but boring work that held an empire together in villages and towns. The arrival of a courier was both ordinary and momentous. Ordinary because it happened regularly. Momentous because each arrival carried news. A governor might open a sealed order bearing the Sultan's tugra, his imperial signature, commanding new taxes or granting new privileges. A soldier might receive word of movement to a new garrison. A merchant might receive a license, or a scholar a summons to court. In an age before telegraph or print, these moments of arrival were the empire's heartbeat, felt in every province but heard only faintly in the center. We might imagine the courier as a solitary figure, and often he was, but in truth he belonged to a system larger than himself. He rode, knowing that others were waiting ahead, that horses were stabled, that stations were manned, that his journey was one link in a chain stretching hundreds of miles. The empire depended not on his individual heroism, but on the persistence of the system, the dull regularity of men doing their duty without pause. There was also a hierarchy within the service. Some couriers carried official orders only, while others were tasked with more routine deliveries. The swiftest were reserved for military dispatches, traveling at a pace that demanded both courage and endurance. Others plodded with administrative reports, slower but no less necessary. Together, they created layers of communication, from the urgent to the mundane. Still, the work was hard. Roads in winter could become seas of mud. In summer, scorching plains tested both horse and rider. Mountains required dismounting, leading the horse by hand. Rivers might demand fording with care, not to wet the precious pouch. Bandits sometimes lay in wait, and though couriers were armed, they were rarely fighters. Their first duty was to preserve the message, even if it meant surrendering goods or fleeing. The empire did not always appreciate its postmen. Their names are seldom recorded, their stories seldom told. They were seen as tools of administration, not as individuals. Yet without them, governors would have been deaf to Istanbul, and Istanbul blind to the provinces. Without them, orders would have gone astray, taxes uncollected, armies unmoved. Their work was as invisible as the roots of a tree, but as essential. And so, through centuries, the couriers of the Ottoman Empire rode from station to station, season to season. They carried words across distances too great for voices to travel. They rarely received thanks, and they left little mark in chronicles. But they were there, steady as the hooves of their horses, patient as the roads beneath them. We often think of empires as strong because of armies or wealth. Yet sometimes their strength lay in things quieter, slower, and less dramatic, in the dusty relay stations, in the bored and weary riders, in the forgotten postman who turned messages into motion. And so we ask, what was it like to live such a life, bound to the road, carrying words that were not your own, and knowing that your work mattered greatly, yet your name would almost certainly vanish from history? To imagine the life of an Ottoman courier, let us slow our pace to theirs, not the gallop of a battlefield messenger, but the steady rhythm of one who lived his days on the road. A courier's life began with readiness. He did not own his route. He belonged to the empire's network, which might call him to ride at dawn or in the middle of the night. When an order arrived, sealed with the tugra of the sultan or the stamp of a provincial official, the courier was summoned. The pouch, leather and sturdy, was given to him. Inside, the folded papers might be brief or thick with decrees. He was not to read them. Their contents were not his to know. His duty was to keep them safe and deliver them swiftly. Before setting out, he checked his horse. Horses were the courier's true companions, though often not his own. At Menzelhain stations, animals were provided by the state. Some were strong Anatolian breeds, others leaner Arabians, prized for endurance. The courier examined the saddle, the reins, the hooves. A loose strap or a stone lodged in the shoe could mean hours lost. Only when all was well did he mount, adjust the pouch to his side, and begin the long road ahead. The rhythm of travel was its own world. On well-trodden roads, the courier might pass peasants carrying firewood, traders with donkeys laden with grain, or pilgrims on their way to shrines. Few spoke to him. His pouch marked him as an agent of authority, and most kept their distance. Some gave him respectful nods, recognizing that he was tied to the empire's machinery. Others looked past him, for he was but a passing shadow, here one moment, gone the next. Dot meals were seldom elaborate. A courier carried what he could flat. At stations, he might be offered a bowl of soup or lentils. The food was fuel, not luxury, meant to sustain the ride. Sometimes he ate in silence by the roadside, the horse tethered nearby. Both man and animal resting before the road drew them onward at night. If no station was near, the courier might sleep in a village khan, an inn where travelers gathered, or even in the open air. He wrapped himself in a cloak, the pouch clutched close, for theft was a constant risk. Bandits haunted the roads, and though the empire tried to suppress them, wide lands could never be fully tamed. A courier's weaponer, short sword, sometimes a pistol, was less for glory than for defense of the pouch. To lose the Sultan's seal was to invite punishment. To lose one's life was regrettable. To lose the message was unforgivable. Yet the greater challenge was not always danger, but monotony. A courier might ride for days without event, the landscape changing slowly, the seasons marking time more than the hours. He knew the bend of each road, the sound of hooves on stone, the sight of fields turning from green to gold. He became intimate with distances, how long it took to reach the next station, how the body ached after certain climbs, how many heartbeats it took for a horse to tire. Despite this, there was a kind of pride in the work. Couriers knew they were threads in the fabric of empire. A governor awaited their arrival. A tax order rested on their speed. Sometimes a soldier's fate turned on the timeliness of their ride. Though their names were forgotten, the importance of their labor was clear. The empire might not see them, but it felt them like the unseen pulse beneath the skin. There were couriers of different ranks. Some were assigned short routes, carrying messages only between nearby towns. Others took the long and arduous journeys across the Balkans, through Anatolia, or into the deserts of Arabia. These men were seasoned, accustomed to solitude, their bodies hardened by the road. The swiftest couriers were chosen for urgent orders, expected to cover hundreds of kilometers in mere days. They rode through storms, through nights lit only by the moon, through terrain that tested horse and rider alike. Each courier developed his own habits. Some muttered prayers as they rode, invoking protection against accident or ambush. Others sang softly to themselves, not for company, but for rhythm. A few spoke to their horses, calling them by affectionate names, coaxing them to keep their pace. To the outside world, these were unremarkable men, but within their solitude they carved small rituals, ways of enduring the endless miles. When a courier reached a station, the exchange was brisk. He dismounted, handed the pouch to the keeper, and either rested or was sent onward with another horse. The station keeper recorded his arrival in ledgers, noting the time, the pouch, the horse. Such records were dry, but they preserved the flow of empire evidence that the line of communication remained unbroken. The courier might sleep for a few hours on a straw mattress, eat a little, tend to his aching legs, and rise again when called. Rest was measured in hours, not days. For some, this life lasted only a few years before they sought other work. The road was harsh, the pay modest, the dangers real. But others remained, their lives marked by journeys rather than by route. They became men of the road, their memories tied not to a single village, but to the length of the empire. They knew the rivers and mountain passes, the names of keepers at distant stations, the wayside shrines where one might stop for a moment of silence. What did they dream of, these couriers? Perhaps of a home they rarely saw, perhaps of being remembered for something more than their miles, yet perhaps also of nothing at all content with the rhythm of the horse, the discipline of the road, the strange peace that comes from a life where every day is the same. Yet every day carries weight. The Ottomans did not raise statues to their couriers. No songs were sung of them in the coffee-houses of Istanbul. Their lives passed without applause, yet their service was steady, almost invisible, and for centuries it endured. In an empire where sultans rose and fell, viziers plotted, armies marched, and fortunes changed, the couriers rode on, tireless, unremarkable, and essential. To live as a courier was to live in motion, never at rest, never at the center, always between places. It was a life that asked little recognition and offered little comfort. Yet, without such lives, the empire's voice would not have carried across its vast dominion. And so, though forgotten in chronicles, the couriers of the Ottoman Empire remain in the quiet imagination as steady figures, men on the road, leather pouches at their sides, horses beneath them, carrying words that bound an empire together, stone by stone, mile by mile, day by day. If you step back from the single courier on his horse, and from the lonely stations scattered across mountains, deserts, and plains, a larger pattern begins to emerge. A network of ink and hoof, paper and seal, quietly stitched together the Ottoman Empire for centuries. It was not glorious like a battlefield, nor majestic like a palace. It was, instead, something patient and unremarkable, a courier carrying a pouch. Day after day, year after year, the empire's strength, after all, was not only in its armies or wealth, but in its ability to communicate. Orders needed to reach distant governors. Tax registers needed to travel from village scribes to provincial capitals, and then onward to Istanbul. Court summonses had to find their way to witnesses living days away. Treaties needed to be signed and returned. And the personal letters of soldiers, merchants, and pilgrims, though less formal, moved within this system too, piggybacking on the official routes when circumstances allowed. The Ottomans inherited much from earlier traditions. The Byzantines had their messengers. The Persians had once run a famed royal road of couriers. Yet the Ottomans made their own adaptations. They did not seek speed alone, but reliability. A letter might take weeks to reach Istanbul from Damascus, but it would arrive. The certainty mattered more than the pace. The state maintained its menzil system, a chain of relay stations across the empire. From the Balkans to Anatolia, from Syria to the Black Sea, the stations were spaced a day's ride apart. Each station held fresh horses, food, lodging, and scribes. Over time, these stations became points of stability in a moving empire, places where one might find shelter, exchange gossip, or meet fellow travelers. Their ledgers, still preserved in some archives, are long lists of arrivals and departures, times and dates, written in neat Ottoman script. Boring to read, perhaps. Yet each entry was the movement of a life, the sound of hooves passing in the night. The empire relied on this quiet system during moments of great importance. When rebellions stirred in the provinces, couriers carried the first warnings. When treaties were signed with European powers, copies were sent through these channels to ensure that distant governors knew the terms. When famines struck or floods ruined crops, reports moved up the chain of command, until imperial kitchens or treasuries were instructed to respond. Behind every crisis, someone on a horse carried the first word of it. Even religion and ritual touched this system. The pilgrimage to Mecca, so central to the empire's Muslim subjects, was not only a journey of faith, but also a logistical puzzle. Couriers moved ahead of caravans, ensuring provisions were prepared, paths cleared, and safety maintained. The empire measured its piety, not only in prayers, but in planning of it carried in writing, and in quieter ways. Letters bound together families. A soldier serving on the frontier might send news back to his village. A merchant in Istanbul might dictate a letter to his family in Konya, updating them on trade. Literacy rates were not high, but scribes stood ready to write and read letters for those who could not. These letters, carried alongside imperial decrees, mixed the ordinary with the official. In their ink, one glimpses the humanity of the system. Parents learning of their sons' survival, brothers sharing news of births, daughters writing blessings to distant fathers. The couriers, for their part, were rarely acknowledged in these exchanges. They were not thanked in the letters, nor remembered in the archives. They were expected to be invisible, like the string on which pearls are strung, holding everything together, but never seen as the jewel itself. Their reward was not glory, but continuity. Still, their presence shaped the empire in subtle ways. Roads were maintained because couriers needed them. Bridges were repaired, not for merchants or peasants alone, but for the regular passage of the pouch. Small villages became linked to greater currents of power because a mensal station sat within them. Even in decay, these traces remain: ruins of stations by old roads, stones of stables where horses once rested, fragments of ledgers now tucked in archives. They are quiet remnants, but they remind us that empire is not built on monuments alone. What is striking, perhaps, is how the system endured so long despite its ordinariness. While sultans changed, viziers rose and fell, armies marched in triumph or defeat, the couriers kept riding. They were not the ones who appeared in court ceremonies or diplomatic paintings. Yet, in their persistence, they embodied something the empire needed most: continuity across time. As the centuries passed, the world changed. New technologies slowly crept into communication. In the 19th century, the telegraph began to outpace the horse. Wires stretched across Anatolia, bringing near-instant messages where once it had taken days. For the couriers, this was the beginning of the end. Their routes shortened, their tasks diminished. Some shifted to local deliveries. Others found new work. The pouch, once heavy with imperial decrees, grew lighter. But for centuries before, theirs had been the steady rhythm of empire. We often think of the Ottomans in terms of palaces, domes, armies, and markets. Yet behind all of that was the humbler work of carrying words across distances. Without that, the empire would have been silent within itself, its commands unheard, its orders unfulfilled, its heart disconnected from its limbs. In remembering the forgotten postman, you remember also the quiet truth of history, that great powers are built not only on victories and rulers, but on countless unnoticed labors. The man who checked his horse's saddle before riding into the night, the keeper who logged the time in his ledger, the scribe who sealed the pouch with wax. These were not dramatic acts, but they were acts that kept an empire alive. When you close your eyes, you might imagine the sound of hooves on a long dirt road. A figure passes, leaning forward in his saddle, the pouch at his side. He does not pause, for the empire waits. He is unremarkable, uncelebrated, but necessary. He disappears into the distance, one among thousands, carrying the silent weight of letters. And though history forgot his name, his path is still with us, in the stones of roads, in the ruins of stations, in the very idea that words can hold people together across space and time. Perhaps that is the most curious lesson of all, that while the couriers themselves faded, the principle they served endures. We still rely on systems that are invisible, unnoticed, and often unappreciated, but without which our world would fracture. The empire's forgotten postmen remind us that history is not only told in battles and thrones, but also in the quiet endurance of men who carried letters until they were no longer needed. When you think of the Roman Empire, your mind may drift to marble temples, towering aqueducts, or triumphal arches. You might imagine senators in togas or generals on horseback. Yet, beneath those grand facades, the humbler material of brick carried much of Rome's weight. Without brick, Rome could not have expanded, rebuilt after fires, or sustained its endless growth. And behind every brick stood men whose names rarely appeared in history, the Roman brickmakers. Unlike marble, which impressed visitors with beauty and permanence, brick was the workhorse of construction. Temples and public baths might boast fine veneers of marble, but beneath them lay walls of baked clay. Whole neighborhoods, barracks, warehouses, and apartment blocks, the insulae, where ordinary Romans lived, rose, brick by brick, shaped by hands that labored in the mud. The Roman saying might as well have been, marble for the gods, brick for the people. The process began in the pits, where clay was dug from the earth. These pits were not romantic quarries, but muddy depressions, often near riverbanks or low-lying land. The clay was sticky, heavy, and needed to be worked free with spades and baskets. Workers carried it in carts or on their backs, loading it for transport to workshops. The clay was mixed with tempering materials, sand, straw, or crushed pottery shards to strengthen it against cracking. Bare feet or wooden paddles churned it until it reached a usable consistency. Then came shaping. Bricks were not molded one at a time, but pressed into wooden frames, sometimes with stamps that marked the workshop's owner. A stamp might bear the name of an imperial estate, a wealthy patron, or even an empress. Archaeologists still find such stamps today. Tiny reminders that brickmaking was tied as much to property and power as to labor. Once shaped, bricks were left to dry. Sun-drying was the first step, rows of flat rectangles laid out on the ground, drying in open air for days or weeks, depending on the season. Workers checked them constantly, turning them to prevent warping, sheltering them from rain. A sudden storm could ruin days of labor, turning neatly molded bricks back into sticky clay. The second stage was firing. Kilns, often built near the workshops, burned day and night. Bricks were stacked inside with narrow gaps to allow the heat to circulate. Wood, charcoal, or even agricultural waste fueled the flames. Firing could last for days, requiring careful tending. Too hot and the bricks cracked. Too cool and they crumbled later in use. Brickmakers developed patience in this, watching smoke, gauging color, adjusting fuel. It was not glamorous, but it was skill, learned by repetition, passed down through generations of anonymous men. The fired bricks emerged red or orange, sometimes with variations depending on the clay. They were durable, stackable, and far more practical than stone for mass building. Unlike stone, brick could be produced locally in abundance, reducing the costs of transport. Unlike timber, it resisted fire. Rome, a city plagued by frequent fires in its crowded quarters, leaned increasingly on brick as it grew. But if brick was practical, brickmaking was exhausting. Laborers bent their backs in clay pits, inhaled smoke from kilns. Many were slaves, tied to estates or workshops. Others were free poor, hired for seasonal work when construction demands rose. The work offered little glory and little rest. The rewards were not monuments or statues, but sore muscles and the slow satisfaction of wages earned. And yet the bricks traveled far. A single workshop's products might be carried miles downriver, loaded onto carts, and delivered to building sites across the empire. Imagine a brickmaker near the Tiber, shaping clay one summer morning. That brick, once dried and fired, might find its way into the wall of a bathhouse, an aqueduct, or a barracks along the frontier. The man who made it would never see the building, never know the lives within its walls. But his work would outlast him. Brick stamps give us small glimpses of this hidden economy. Some bear the names of estates belonging to Emperors Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius, Septimius, Severus. Others carry the marks of noblewomen, such as Domitia Lucilla, mother of Marcus Aurelius, whose brick estates supplied much of 2nd century Rome. These names remind us that brickmaking was not only labor, but also wealth. Elite families controlled clay pits and kilns, reaping profit from the demand of a city that never stopped building. The slaves and workers remained nameless, but the owners' names were baked into history, quite literally, on the bricks themselves. The rhythm of a brickmaker's year followed the seasons. Winter rains made clay pits too wet, so much work paused. Spring and summer brought intensive digging, shaping, and firing. By autumn, workshops rushed to complete orders before weather turned. During harvest, laborers were sometimes pulled away for farm work, leaving only the core slaves to maintain production. The empire's rhythms, war campaigns, urban fires, imperial projects all shaped the workload. A new emperor's building spree could mean years of grueling demand. Life at the kilns was not silent. Workers shouted over the clatter of carts, children carried water, overseers barked orders, dogs barked at the edges of the yards. Smoke hung thick in the air, mixing with the smell of wet clay and sweat. Fires glowed at night, casting orange light over the yards. For those living nearby, brickmaking was not just an occupation, but a landscape. Pits, kilns, smoke, noise, and always the same motions repeated. Dig, mix, mold, dry, fire. Day after day, brick by brick, a city took shape. Rome, in its grandeur, rose from the mud, its elegance resting on the invisible shoulders of men who spent their lives in clay. To reflect on this is to ask, how much of Rome's strength lay not in marble or steel, but in something as ordinary as fired earth? And what did the men who made it think, if they thought at all, of the empire built from their endless labor. If you walk through the ruins of Rome today, you may see arches of brick peeking through crumbling marble, or long walls of exposed red clay where once a smoother surface covered them. Time has peeled back the veneer of grandeur to reveal the skeleton beneath. And that skeleton, more often than not, is brick. Rome liked to present itself as marble. Augustus himself boasted that he found the city in brick and left it in marble. The phrase has lived on, suggesting a leap from rustic simplicity to urban magnificence. Yet behind that marble, brick never went away. In fact, marble was often no more than a thin surface, slabs fixed over brick walls, giving the illusion of solidity and wealth, while the true weight was borne by baked clay. To say Rome was built of marble is a statement of appearance. To say Rome was built of brick is to tell the truth. The uses of brick were everywhere. Consider the great aqueducts that carried water into the city. Their arches often combined stone with brick, the latter adding strength and regularity to construction. Public baths, massive complexes of vaulted rooms, relied heavily on brick for their domes and arches. Temples and basilicas, though faced in marble, had walls of brick underneath. Even the Colosseum, that symbol of Rome's might, employed brick extensively in its inner walls and vaults. Then there were the insulae, the apartment blocks that housed much of Rome's population. These were not buildings of glory, but of necessity, tall, narrow, and crowded, rising 5 or more stories. Brick allowed them to be built quickly and cheaply, though not always safely. Collapses were common, fires even more so. Yet, without brick, the city could never have contained its swelling numbers. The ordinary Roman, whether a shopkeeper, a clerk, or a laborer, lived surrounded by bricks, not marble. The flexibility of brick was part of its appeal. It could be cut into thin tiles for facing, used whole for walls, or shaped into curved forms for arches. Roman builders developed a distinctive style known as opus latericium, thin bricks laid in neat horizontal courses, often combined with concrete. These methods allowed for efficient construction, strong enough to last centuries. Even in decay, the walls of brick remain stubbornly standing, testifying to the durability of clay baked in fire. Brick also marked time in subtle ways. Archaeologists, studying brick stamps, can date buildings to specific years or even months. Since stamps often recorded the consuls in office at the time. Thus, the humble stamp left by a workshop laborer allows us to trace the construction of entire neighborhoods. The political history of Ramit's officials, its regimes is mirrored in the marks on bricks. History survives not only in marble inscriptions, but also in the impressions pressed into clay by tired hands. For wealthy Romans, bricks were investments as well as building blocks. Estates devoted to brick production provided steady income. The demand never ceased. Fires, floods, and building programs kept workshops busy year after year. Owning brickfields near Rome was as reliable a source of wealth as owning vineyards. And so, while slaves and workers molded clay, senators and noblewomen collected rents and profits, their fortunes rising on the backs of bricks. The labor of brickmaking also shaped the landscape of Rome itself. Workshops clustered near the city, especially along the Tiber, where clay was abundant and transport easy. Kilns smoked in the suburbs, supplying the constant demand. Barges carried bricks downriver, unloading them close to building sites. From the riverbanks to the 7 hills, the flow of clay turned into walls and domes. One could almost imagine the city as a living kiln, endlessly transforming mud into form. The military, too, relied on brick. On distant frontiers, legions built forts with bricks stamped by their own marks. These stamps sometimes bore the legion's number or symbol, reminders that soldiers were not only fighters but also builders. Roads, bridges, baths, and walls in Britain, Gaul, and North Africa still carry these traces. A Roman soldier, known for discipline, might one day wield a sword, and the next press clay into molds for his unit's next construction. This dual use of brick in both the heart of the city and the edges of the empire underscores its quiet importance. It was not rare or luxurious, but practical, universal, and adaptable. To the emperor, brick was a way to rebuild quickly after disasters. To the soldier, it was a way to make a frontier livable. To the ordinary citizen, it was simply the material of daily life. The walls of the home, the floors beneath sandals, the baths visited each week. In Rome, fires were frequent and devastating. Entire neighborhoods could vanish overnight. Yet brick allowed rebuilding with remarkable speed. Wooden structures gave way, gradually, to brick insulae, safer though still imperfect. After the Great Fire of 64 CE, under Nero, rebuilding programs leaned heavily on brick, which could be produced in abundance to meet sudden demand. Disasters, though destructive, often filled the brickmakers' kilns with urgency. As we consider this, it is worth pausing to reflect. What does it mean that the grandeur of Rome, so often remembered in stone and marble, rested so completely on the backs of bricks? The emperors paraded in marble halls, but those halls were held up by fired clay. The senators debated beneath roofs supported by brick arches. The aqueducts that fed Rome's fountains and baths depended on red bricks pressed in muddy pits. Even now, the ruins bear witness. The marble has often been stripped away, reused in later ages, carried off to build churches or palaces. But the bricks remain, exposed to the sun and weather, their edges still crisp after nearly 2,000 years. The empire's bones, stripped of ornament, show themselves to have been made of earth. It is perhaps the greatest irony of Roman history that what was considered common and ordinary mud pressed into shapes, baked in fire, has outlasted what was prized as noble and divine. Marble cracked, toppled, and was looted. Brick stayed put. And so, in silence, the work of the brickmakers has endured longer than the triumphs of the emperors, who never thought to name them. This raises a quiet question. When we remember the Roman Empire, do we remember its emperors? Do we, unknowingly, walk among the work of men whose names were lost in the clay? When the Roman Empire began to crumble, its marble monuments often fell victim to neglect, weather, or human greed. Marble was precious, easy to reuse, and valuable in later centuries when new rulers sought materials for their own churches, palaces, or fortifications. Quarrying stone was hard and costly. Stripping marble from old temples was much easier, and so, little by little, the gleaming facades of Rome's public buildings vanished. The statues were toppled, the columns hauled away, the panels cut down to size. Medieval Rome became a scavenger's yard. its marble treasures carried off to adorn the Vatican, two-line churches, or even to be burned for lime in kilns. Yet beneath the marble veneer, the bricks remained. Walls that had once been hidden now stood bare, their red patterns revealed to the sun. It is for this reason that, when we walk through the ruins of Rome today, we see not marble but brick. The survival of Rome rests less on marble's grandeur than on brick's persistence. This quiet survival was not limited to Rome. Across the empire, Roman bricks continued to outlast the centuries. In Britain, fragments of Roman walls still poke up in London, York, and St. Albans, the reddish hue of the clay standing out against later stonework. In North Africa, the remains of bathhouses and fortresses show the same brick arches that once held domes and roofs. In Gaul, in Spain, along the Danube, the pattern repeats: marble stripped, stone crumbled, brick endured. Part of this durability lay in the very nature of brick. Fired clay is surprisingly resilient, able to withstand centuries of weather if left undisturbed. But part also lies in human habit. While marble invited looting and stone was easy to break down, bricks were less appealing to steal. They were heavy, irregular, and not easily reused in large numbers. Thus, they stayed where they were. Their survival ensured precisely because they were ordinary. Over time, later builders began to imitate Roman brickwork, sometimes even incorporating ancient bricks into medieval structures. In Rome itself, medieval churches rose on ancient foundations, their walls patched with old Roman tiles. Farmers in the countryside collected stray Roman bricks from ruins and used them to mend houses or barns. The Roman brick thus found a second life, no longer part of an empire's grandeur, but serving quietly in ordinary homes. This recycling was not always respectful. Many kilns in the Middle Ages burned ancient marble to make lime, leaving brick as the only surviving material. If marble was sacrificed to utility, brick was spared by neglect. What once had been considered humble became, through endurance, the truest witness of Roman life. The study of bricks eventually became a discipline in its own right. Archaeologists learned to read the layers of history in their patterns. A wall built in opus lateritium thin, neat bricks in horizontal rows might be dated to the reign of Augustus. A wall with thicker, less precise bricks might belong to a later period. Stamps pressed into bricks recorded the names of consuls or emperors, anchoring them in time. Even without inscriptions or documents, bricks quietly told their story to those patient enough to read them. In this sense, the Roman brickmaker's work became a kind of archive. The emperor might have built monuments to himself in marble, but the workers who pressed clay left behind a more reliable record. Every stamp, every wall, every arch carries the memory of their labor. Not their names, perhaps, but their presence. There is something quietly poetic in this. The men and women who labored at the edge of the city, hands muddy, backs sore from lifting tiles and firing kilns, could never have imagined that their work would still be standing nearly 2,000 years later. They could not have guessed that scholars in distant centuries would pore over their stamps, tracing the flow of their work across time. Their daily toil, unremarkable to them, became one of the most lasting legacies of the empire. The endurance of brick also reshaped how we perceive Rome itself. When tourists visit the ruins today, many are surprised to see so much brick where they expect marble. The Colosseum's outer shell hints at grandeur, but its interior reveals endless brick arches. The baths of Caracalla, stripped of ornament, are vast caverns of red clay, far from the glittering city described in ancient poetry. Rome appears as a city of brickwork, its practical heart exposed. This is not entirely inaccurate. For the average Roman, life was never about marble. A shopkeeper lived in a brick apartment, prayed in a temple built of brick beneath marble panels, fetched water from a fountain supplied by a brick aqueduct. To remember Rome in brick rather than marble is to see it closer to how it truly was, a working, bustling city sustained by earth and fire. And what of the brickmakers themselves? Their names are gone, erased by time. Occasionally, a workshop owner's stamp survives, but the slaves and laborers remain anonymous. Yet their legacy is everywhere, even if silent. It is their hands that shaped the empire's foundations, their sweat that turned clay into permanence. If there is a lesson in their story, it is this: history often remembers the grand and forgets the ordinary. Yet sometimes the ordinary endures longer. Bricks last, bricks hold. Bricks are stubborn, refusing to vanish even when marble falls in the quiet ruins of Rome. Among the broken arches and half-standing walls, we walk among their work. The emperors may have claimed eternity, but it was the brickmakers who, unknowingly, gave it substance. So, the next time one stands in Rome, gazing at an ancient wall, it is worth pausing to imagine the moment of its creation: a handful of wet clay, pressed into a wooden mold, lifted carefully to dry, then baked in a smoky kiln. Multiply that act by millions, repeated by countless workers, and the result is an empire built not on marble dreams but on fired earth. And so our story comes to rest. The brickmakers of Rome left no epics, no statues, no inscriptions of triumph. Their legacy was quieter, more patient. Brick by brick, they gave the empire its bones. Marble spoke loudly, but brick endured silently, and in that silence, the empire remains. If you were to step into an ordinary household in the ancient world, whether in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, or China, you might not see gold or marble, but you would almost certainly see thread. Not in the form of finished clothing, though garments were everywhere, but in baskets of fiber waiting to be spun, in balls of yarn, in the faint creak of a loom standing in a corner. Thread was as common as bread. It clothed the body, bound tools together, and even served as currency in some places. We often think of ancient history in terms of kings and battles, but daily life was shaped by humbler things. Before coins and before paper, before libraries and amphitheaters, people relied on the humble loom. It was the loom, more than monuments or armies, that connected lives in a literal, physical sense. The loom transformed raw fibers, wool, flax, cotton, silk into cloth, the essential covering for survival. Without it, warmth would have been scarce, trade networks thinner, and entire cultures poorer. The earliest looms were simple, upright sticks or frames, where fibers were hung and weighted, their taut vertical threads forming the warp. Across these warp threads, people passed the weft, pushing it back and forth with fingers or sticks until a fabric slowly emerged. The technology was not complicated, yet it required patience. Hours might pass to produce only a small square of cloth. Days could stretch into weeks for a single garment's worth of fabric. The evidence of these early tools survives not in wood or rope, which decayed, but in impressions left in clay and in fragments of woven fabric found buried in graves or preserved in deserts. Archaeologists sometimes find loom weights, small baked clay discs with holes that once kept the warp taut. These little weights, scattered in the earth, tell us that looms stood in homes thousands of years ago. Imagine a Mesopotamian courtyard. Around 3000 BCE, the sun is hot, but a loom stands in the shade of a mud brick wall. A woman, perhaps the matron of the household or perhaps a slave, is weaving narrow bands of linen. Each pass of the weft takes only a moment, but the repetition stretches endlessly. Behind her, jars of barley beer and bread ovens sustain the family, but it is the loom that makes the garments to clothe them. Her hands know the work without thought. Lift the thread, pass the shuttle, press it down, and repeat. The rhythm of weaving became a kind of heartbeat for ancient communities. The sound of beating the weft into place, thunk, 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 carried across courtyards and through alleys. In Egypt, flax was stripped and spun into linen that clothed not only the living, but also the dead. 4 mummies were swaddled in strips of woven fabric. In Greece, wool from flocks was washed, carded, and woven into cloaks for soldiers. In China, silk threads were drawn from cocoons and carefully twisted before being woven into shimmering fabric that would one day travel along trade routes to distant lands. The loom was universal, yet its designs varied by place and time. Some were upright looms, leaning against a wall with weights holding the warp. Others were horizontal, stretched between pegs hammered into the ground. Later, more advanced looms developed heddle simple frames that lifted alternating warp threads, making the passage of the weft faster and more even. Each innovation shaved a little time from the endless labor, yet weaving remained slow. Painstaking work. What made weaving so essential was not just clothing. Cloth itself became a unit of wealth and exchange. In early Mesopotamia, temple accounts recorded deliveries of woolen textiles as offerings. In Egypt, linen rolls could be used in trade. In Scandinavia, long after Rome had fallen, woven cloth served as a form of currency. A bolt of fabric was not simply a practical good, it was portable wealth. To own a loom was to own the means of economic survival. For women, especially, the loom was a lifelong companion. In many societies, spinning and weaving defined female labor. Greek literature is filled with references to women at the loom. Penelope, wife of Odysseus, famously wove by day and secretly unraveled by night to delay remarriage. The loom stood for patience, endurance, and fidelity. In Rome, noble women were praised for personally weaving garments for their husbands, even when slaves could do the task. In China, the weaving of silk was so significant that empresses presided over ceremonies honoring the silkworms, symbolizing their role in sustaining the empire. And yet, despite its importance, weaving rarely appeared in records of power. Battles were written down, kings inscribed their victories in stone, but the steady work of producing fabric was left uncelebrated. The loom stood in the shadows, its thread binding communities together While going largely unnoticed in official histories, the materials themselves shaped how people lived. Wool meant flocks of sheep grazing fields. Flax meant long hours of retting stalks in water, then pounding and combing fibers into threads. Cotton, where it grew, was spun into softer fabrics, easier to wash and more comfortable in heat. Silk, fragile and precious, required specialized labor, and its secrecy was guarded fiercely in China for centuries. Each fiber carried not just physical qualities, but social meaning. Wool was sturdy and practical. Linen was cool and ritualistic, tied to burial. Silk shimmered with luxury, marking status and wealth. Cloth also carried time. A single garment was the result of countless hours of labor gathering fibers, spinning thread, weaving cloth, cutting, and sewing. To put on a tunic was to wear the invisible weight of hundreds of hours of someone's life. In this sense, clothing in the ancient world was never trivial. Each thread bore the memory of labor, and each loom was a site where time itself was converted into fabric. The persistence of looms across cultures shows how deeply woven they were into human survival. In desert tombs of Egypt, fragments of linen remain crisp after thousands of years. In bogs of northern Europe, cloaks of wool have emerged, dark but intact. In Chinese tombs, silk robes still shimmer faintly, their threads astonishingly fine. These remnants remind us that behind every empire, someone had to weave. Yet the loom also carried symbolism. Weaving became a metaphor for fate. In Greek myth, the Moirai, the Fates, were imagined as spinners and weavers, drawing out the threads of life, weaving them into a pattern, and cutting them at death. Life itself was a textile, fragile and patterned, and the loom of the gods never stopped. Similar ideas appeared elsewhere. In India, Vedic hymns compared the universe to a woven cloth. In Norse myth, goddesses called the Norns wove destiny beneath the roots of Ygritte. Across cultures, the loom was more than a tool. It was a mirror of existence. It is worth pausing to consider what it meant to live in a world where every piece of cloth had to be made this way. Today, fabrics are produced by machines in quantities beyond imagination. But in antiquity, every tunic, cloak, and robe was born on a loom. The clothes of armies, the sails of ships, the wrappings of the dead, all of them came from hands at work, thread by thread. When we think of the great monuments of antiquity, the pyramids, the Parthenon, the Great Wall, we should also think of the quieter monuments that never stood, the looms in every home, the countless hours of weaving that clothed the builders, fed the trade routes, and allowed the very idea of civilization to take root. In every generation, new hands took up the threads. The work was repetitive, endless, and in its own way eternal. The thread that never ends passed from mother to daughter, from workshop to workshop, binding centuries together. And perhaps this is the most striking thought. If history is often told in battles and reigns, then weaving tells it in persistent and nearly invisible, but holding everything together. By the time empires began to stretch their borders, looms had already been shaping daily life for centuries. What changed under kingdoms and empires was not the loom itself. It remained a humble frame of wood and fiber, but the scale of its labor. What had once been a household tool became a machine of economy, taxation, and control. In Mesopotamia, Temple economies were the first to marshal weaving on a large scale. Clay tablets from Yor and Lagash list astonishing numbers of female weavers attached to temples. Their daily rations carefully calculated. These women, often laborers or slaves, worked in long halls lined with looms. Their output was recorded, their hours monitored. A cloak or tunic was not only clothing but also an entry in an administrative ledger. Textiles moved from temple workshops to storerooms, from storerooms to merchants, and from merchants to distant lands. The scale was immense. Records suggest that thousands of workers were engaged in producing cloth for distribution. The loom, once part of family survival, had been absorbed into the machinery of the state. Each thread became part of a larger web that bound subjects to their rulers. Egypt, too, organized weaving on a mass scale. Linen production fed both domestic needs and international trade. Pharaohs demanded tribute in cloth, and warehouses filled with bolts of fabric. In the Valley of the Kings, tombs reveal layers upon layers of linen wrapping mummies, sometimes hundreds of meters of fabrics surrounding a single body. Each strip was once spun and woven by human hands. The labor that clothed the dead equaled, and sometimes exceeded, that which clothed the living. In Greece and Rome, weaving maintained a dual identity: household craft and economic engine. Wealthy Roman estates included weaving workshops staffed by slaves. Their production supplied not only the family, but also the market. Roman soldiers marched in woolen tunics woven in such workshops, their armor strapped with linen bindings, their camps sheltered beneath woven tents. The empire's ability to project force depended, invisibly, on the steady work of looms. Trade routes spread cloth far beyond the reach of local fields and flocks. Wool from the Mediterranean traveled north. Linen from Egypt traveled east. Silk from China traveled west. Each kind of cloth carried prestige, its texture and color communicating status. The famous Silk Road was named not for spices or horses or precious stones, but for fabric. Cloth was not only useful, it was desirable. China's role in this story cannot be overstated. The cultivation of silkworms and the weaving of silk thread was a guarded state secret for centuries. Legend told of the Empress Lezu, who discovered silk when a cocoon fell into her teacup. Whatever its true origins, silk weaving became a cornerstone of Chinese economy and diplomacy. Bolts of shimmering fabric traveled across Asia, traded for horses, gold, and influence. The state tightly controlled silk production, making it a symbol of imperial power as much as a textile. The Persian Empire, at its height, likewise leaned on textiles. Persian carpets, woven on large looms, became renowned for their durability and design. More than decoration, they were mobile floors, warmth in cold climates, and symbols of rank. The Achaemenid kings demanded tribute in textiles from subject regions, and in turn gifted fine fabrics to allies. To weave was to participate, however distantly, in the politics of empire. What is striking is how often women remained at the heart of weaving, even as empires expanded. In domestic spaces, women wove for family survival. In workshops, women labored under overseers. In myths and literature, weaving retained its gendered symbolism. Yet, in every case, the quiet motion of passing thread through thread sustained the larger economies of state. It was work both invisible and indispensable. Textiles also served as records of wealth. In inventories of estates, bolts of cloth appear alongside livestock and land. Cloth was portable, divisible, and durable. Where coins were rare or unreliable, cloth could be counted and traded. In Viking Age Scandinavia, cloth lengths called ells were used as currency, and the quality of the weaving itself determined the value. The loom became, indirectly, a mint dot color added another layer. Dyes were costly, and the labor to fix color into cloth was immense. Purple, drawn from Mediterranean shellfish, required thousands of creatures for a single robe. To wear Tyrian purple was to announce wealth and power on a scale most could not imagine. Blue from indigo, red from madder root, yellow from saffronol became marks of trade and status. Each dye transformed humble thread into something rare. The loom carried not just thread, but color, symbol, and identity. Textile production also spurred technological refinement. The introduction of heddles allowed weavers to lift alternating warp threads at once, speeding the process. The invention of the warp-weighted loom, where stones kept threads taut, enabled larger fabrics. Horizontal looms spread in parts of Asia, allowing greater complexity in patterns. Each shift represented a small saving in labor, multiplied thousands of times across workshops and households. The loom was never static. It, too, evolved under the pressure of demand. Religious life absorbed cloth into its rituals. Temples were draped in woven hangings. Priests wore garments of prescribed fibers and colors. In some cultures, cloth itself was offered as sacrifice. In Mesoamerica, woven mantles were presented to gods and rulers alike, their patterns carrying symbolic meaning. The loom thus became not only a tool of survival and trade, but also an instrument of devotion. And still, behind all this grandeur, the sound of weaving remained the same. The shuttle's passage, the press of the beater, the measured growth of cloth. Whether in a royal workshop or a village hut, the work was repetitive and slow. Weeks stretched into months to create a single bolt of fine cloth. For armies, temples, and markets to be clothed, countless hands had to labor in silence. Consider a Roman legion. Tens of thousands of men required tunics, cloaks, tents, and blankets. Each item represented not only wool and dye, but also the hours of weavers far from the battlefield. The power of the legions rested, in part, on the unseen support of looms. No general boasted of cloth, yet without it, campaigns could not proceed. A soldier shivering without a cloak, or a sail tearing for lack of sturdy weaving, could alter the fate of armies. It is this quiet dependence that makes weaving one of the great invisible forces of history. States rose and fell, but the loom kept working. Kings taxed it, priests blessed it, merchants traded it, women tended it, and across generations, thread by thread, looms spun not just fabric, but the material framework of empires by the later centuries of the Roman Empire. Textile workshops were so central that officials monitored them closely. Some workshops produced cloth for the unknowna, the imperial supply system. Others filled contracts for the army. Weaving, once a symbol of household life, had become institutional, and yet, despite the scale, the loom still required human patience. No machine replaced the hands that lifted, passed, and pressed. The thread that never ends stretched across continents, but it was still built upon repetition. When the great empires waned, when Rome withdrew from its provinces, when dynasties collapsed, when trade routes faltered, the loom remained. Kingdoms might crumble, but clothing was still needed. Sails were still stretched across ships, cloaks were still wrapped against the wind. The loom, quiet and patient, crossed into the Middle Ages almost unchanged. What did change was its social place. In early medieval Europe, weaving returned primarily to the household. Villas were gone, workshops dismantled, supply chains broken. Women once again wove for family survival, spinning wool or flax and weaving rough cloth on small looms. A single cloak or tunic, thick and practical, could take weeks of work, its weave uneven, its dye muted. Yet these garments were durable, and in cold climates they made the difference between endurance and hardship. In villages, the sound of the loom was as common as the crackle of a hearth. Wool sheared in spring became spun yarn by summer, woven cloth by autumn, and sewn garments by winter. The cycle matched the agricultural year, weaving itself into the rhythm of survival. Each family kept at least a spindle and some form of loom, even if crude, because dependence on neighbors or markets was risky. A household without thread was a household exposed. But weaving did not remain purely domestic. As towns grew in the later Middle Ages, weaving became a craft, recognized and organized. In Europe, guilds of weavers formed, regulating the quality and price of cloth. They established apprenticeships, enforced standards, and sometimes fought bitterly with dyers or fullers over control of the textile process. Cloth was no longer only for warmth, fit was a commodity. The backbone of markets and fairs. By the 12th and 13th centuries, entire regions were known for their textiles. Flanders produced fine woolen cloth that traveled to Italy and beyond. In northern Italy, silk weaving took root, inspired by techniques brought from Byzantium. In the Islamic world, Damascus and Baghdad were famed for patterned textiles, their looms capable of intricate designs that dazzled European merchants. The loom had expanded from survival to artistry, from necessity to symbol. Weaving towns thrived. Bruges, Ghent, and Florence became wealthy on cloth exports, their streets lined with workshops. Merchants rose in status, cities grew in influence, and wars were fought over the control of textile-producing regions. The loom, still humble in design, underpinned an economic transformation. Yet, at its heart, the process remained slow. The weaver still passed the shuttle, pressed the beater, shifted the head. The thread still accumulated, inch by inch, row by row. Even in a bustling guild hall, filled with the sound of dozens of looms, the work was patient and repetitive. A fine length of cloth could take weeks, even months, to finish. The wealth of cities rested on this monotony. In rural households, weaving retained its quieter role. Women spun while watching children or tending fires. They wove simple cloth for family needs, sometimes selling surplus at local markets. In Iceland and parts of Scandinavia, woven cloth was measured in standardized lengths and used directly as money, its value tied to the evenness of the weave. A bolt of cloth could be counted out like coins. Here, the loom was not only survival, but also currency. Meanwhile, in China, the imperial workshops of the Temps and Song dynasties advanced weaving into extraordinary refinement. Silk brocades, patterned with complex designs, demonstrated both technical mastery and artistic imagination. The labor was immense, but the results shimmered with status. Silk remained a diplomatic gift, a medium of exchange, and a treasure along the Silk Road. The loom in China was not merely a household tool, but a state instrument, producing both beauty and political capital. Across the Islamic world, weaving likewise flourished. Carpets and textiles became famous not only for durability, but for intricate patterns, many with symbolic meaning. Workshops in Persia and Anatolia wove carpets that served both as practical furnishings and as markers of wealth and prestige. These looms were as central to daily life as any mosque or market. The universality of the loom is striking. In every culture, from Japan to West Africa, looms took forms adapted to local fibers and traditions. In West Africa, narrow strip weaving produced textiles later sewn together into larger cloths. In the Andes backstrap, looms produced patterned garments that carried cultural meaning as well as warmth. Everywhere, the loom reflected both necessity and identity. The Middle Ages also deepened the symbolic weight of weaving. Monastic writers used the loom as a metaphor for spiritual life. Threads represented virtues, patterns symbolized order. In sermons, weaving was invoked to describe the labor of prayer, repetitive, disciplined, humble. The cloth that emerged was likened to the soul, woven slowly through daily devotion. In literature, too, weaving persisted as a metaphor. Medieval romances referenced the work of ladies at looms, spinning and weaving while waiting for absent knights. The loom became an image of patience, of continuity, of the quiet work that sustained life while wars raged. Yet despite all its importance, weaving remained largely invisible in written history. Chronicles recorded kings and crusades, but seldom the weavers who clothed the soldiers or the women who produced the linens for altars. The loom remained in the shadows, its contributions assumed rather than celebrated. What changed, gradually, was technology. By the late medieval period, horizontal looms with treadles appeared in Europe. These looms allowed weavers to control warp threads with their feet, freeing their hands and speeding production. The rhythm shifted slightly. The clatter of treadles joined the sound of shuttles. With treadle looms, larger and more complex cloth could be woven more efficiently. Still, progress was incremental. For centuries, the loom resisted rapid transformation. It remained stubbornly dependent on human patience, human rhythm, human hands. Even as guilds rose and cities prospered, even as global trade expanded, weaving continued in the same familiar cadence. The loom's persistence carried into early modern life. In the 16th and 17th centuries, European merchants grew rich on cloth trade, particularly wool and linen. Colonies provided new fibers, cotton above all, that would reshape global weaving. Yet in each case, the loom awaited the spinner's thread, the weaver's time, the shuttle's passage. By the eve of the Industrial Revolution, weaving had already bound the world together. Cotton from India and later from the Americas, silk from China, wool from Europe, dyes from across the globe all converged in workshops where looms clattered steadily. The loom had become global, Yet it still looked much like the simple frames of antiquity. And then, in the 18th and 19th centuries, the loom finally changed. Mechanization introduced power looms, driven by water wheels and steam. The quiet rhythm of hand looms gave way to the thunder of machines. Cloth that once took weeks to weave could now be produced in days, then in hours. For the first time, the loom was no longer tied to the patient motion of a single pair of hands. This transformation was profound, but it also meant the end of an ancient continuity. For thousands of years, looms had been personal, household, communal. Each thread bore the imprint of the weaver's hand. The Industrial Revolution broke that bond. Weaving became mechanical, impersonal, a matter of speed rather than rhythm. Yet even in this shift, the memory of the loom endured. In some places, hand looms survived as traditions, producing fabrics valued for their slowness and individuality. In others, power looms expanded rapidly, clothing the world more cheaply than ever before. But beneath both, the thread remained the same. Fibers twisted, passed, and joined into cloth. The history of the loom, then, is not a story of invention and replacement, but of endurance. For millennia, the loom shaped human survival, economy, art, and ritual. Its rhythm was the heartbeat of households and empires alike. The thread that never ends wove together not just cloth, but cultures. And when we trace our fingers over a fabric today, whether machine-made or hand-woven, we touch the distant echo of that ancient rhythm. A thread passed through another thread, pressed into place, growing quietly into something whole. The loom was never loud. It never demanded attention. It simply continued thread by thread, shuttle by shuttle, century by century. In that persistence lies its history, not of heroes or conquests, but of patience, repetition, and endurance. The thread never ends. And so, the thread continues. From the looms of ancient homes, to the guild halls of medieval towns, to the quiet corners where weaving was more survival than art. The cloth of history was made, slowly, patiently, one shuttle pass at a time. The hands that wove are long gone, the garments they made have long turned to dust. But the rhythm of weaving, the steady pattern of warp and weft, is still with us, echoing in every piece of fabric that touches our lives. History, too, is like a loom. Thread by thread, it weaves together countless forgotten details into a fabric strong enough to endure. As you drift now into rest, you might imagine the faint sound of a loom in the distance, a gentle, endless rhythm, weaving quietly, as it always has, through the centuries. And into dreams, good night.